Welcome back to Terrified Tales, where the rain falls slow and the fear creeps in quicker. Like and subscribe before we begin, and tell us where and when you're listening. Midnight, alone, that's when they find you. The fog hung thick over Hesperus, a town caught in a perpetual state of decay. Ezra Caldwell had arrived at the edge of it, not by choice, but by necessity. The car rumbled through the narrow streets, past houses with broken windows, empty shops, and rusted gates. It was the kind of place where time seemed to have forgotten its place, where the weight of silence pressed against every wall. The air smelled of earth and neglect, a heavy scent that mingled with the dampness of the fog. The town was small, its inhabitants sparse, as if it were slowly retreating into the ground, waiting for something to claim it fully. Ezra wasn't here for the charm or the scenery. He wasn't here for the promise of peace either. He was here because there was nowhere else. His brother's death had left him adrift, and after months of numbness, the idea of isolation in a town this quiet had a strange appeal. A place where no one knew him, where his guilt and grief could settle like the fog, unnoticed and unheard. He turned the key in the ignition, the engine cutting off with a dull sputter. The silence was immediate, oppressive. Even the birds had stopped singing, as if they too had abandoned the place. Ezra stepped out of the car, his boots sinking into the wet earth as he unloaded his bags into the small house he'd rented. It was a single-story structure, tucked away at the edge of town, surrounded by tall, overgrown grass and crooked trees that seemed to stretch toward the heavens like blackened fingers. It had the feel of a forgotten place, not quite abandoned, but not quite alive either. The house smelled musty, the air thick with dust. It was empty, intentionally so. No trace of anyone who'd lived there before. It felt like an echo, a hollow space just waiting to be filled with noise. Ezra set down his bag and took a deep breath. His pulse quickened, but it was more from the weight of the memories he carried than from the eerie quiet surrounding him. He pushed the thought away. He was here to start over. He crossed the threshold and into the living room, its windows looking out over the fading town. A wooden coffee table sat in the center along with an old worn couch. A few dusty paintings hung crooked on the walls, depicting indistinct landscapes. The walls seemed to close in on him, thick and heavy with time. His breath caught as he walked further into the house, his eyes wandering to the shelf in the corner. There, half buried beneath piles of forgotten belongings, was a box. His hand trembled as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the worn edges of the cardboard. Inside, he found old photographs, images of a time long past. His family, his parents, and most haunting of all, his brother, Theo. The box was filled with small trinkets, old letters, and broken pieces of forgotten memories. At the very bottom, hidden beneath layers of old fabric and tattered paper, lay a small necklace. Ezra's breath caught in his throat as his fingers closed around the pendant. The necklace had once belonged to Theo, a small, delicate silver charm that resembled a sound wave, its edges smooth, as if it had been worn until it had become a part of him. It was nothing more than a trinket, a relic of the past. But when Ezra held it in his hands, a faint hum, just barely audible, seemed to reverberate through the air. He held the necklace up to his ear, his fingers shaking as the sound grew louder, sharper, his stomach twisted. No, this couldn't be real. It had been years since he'd last seen this necklace, since Theo, since the accident that took everything from him. The hum was a trick of the mind, a part of his grief. He looked around the room, the walls closing in, tighter. The fog outside seemed to creep toward the house, thickening in the air. A low, distant sound echoed from the window, as if something was moving just beyond the glass. Ezra flinched, his eyes darting to the corner of the room where shadows played along the walls. There was nothing there, just the remnants of a life he no longer wanted to remember. He slipped the necklace into his pocket, shaking his head to clear the thoughts that were starting to spiral out of control. The sound, the memories, they didn't matter. He was here to find peace, to escape, to rebuild. He needed to silence the ghosts that still clung to him. With a sigh, Ezra collapsed onto the couch, his body sinking into the worn fabric. His eyes drifted to the window once more, staring into the mist, and in that moment, he realized something unsettling. The town was not silent at all. The hum from the necklace was still there, faint but persistent. It seemed to be coming from somewhere far off in the distance, echoing through the fog. And for the first time, Ezra wasn't sure if it was just his mind playing tricks on him, or something else entirely. The next morning, the fog had not lifted. It clung to the streets, swirling in thick, oppressive veils that made the town appear even more deserted. Ezra stood at the window of his small house, watching the world beyond fade into a hazy blur. The silence of the town was maddening. No birds singing, no distant chatter, not even the usual hum of traffic. It felt like a place caught between worlds, suspended in time. His chest tightened. The only sound that pierced the quiet was the faint hum of the necklace tucked in his pocket. But even that seemed distant now, almost as if it had been a figment of his imagination. Still, the unease lingered. Ezra stepped away from the window, determined to make the most of his new start, however ill-timed the decision had been. There had to be something to do in this town, even if it was just to break the isolation. He left the house and walked down the street, passing through the town center, his footsteps muffled by the thick fog that had seeped into every corner of the town. The street lamps were old, their glass cracked, the iron poles rusted, and their light barely cut through the mist. Shops stood abandoned, their windows fogged up, their signs swaying lazily in the wind, advertising services long forgotten. A single small cafe stood at the corner, its door open, as if inviting him to step inside. Ezra hesitated, but then, feeling the weight of solitude pressing in, he crossed the threshold. The interior of the cafe was dimly lit, with vintage posters lining the walls and old wooden tables scattered throughout the room. A counter stood, to the right, behind which an elderly woman was busy wiping down cups. She didn't look up when he entered, lost in her task, but he could feel her eyes on him through the corners of her glasses. "Quiet day," Ezra said, trying to make light of the silence that still clung to the town. The woman glanced at him briefly, her eyes sharp behind her thick spectacles. "Too quiet," she muttered. "But that's how things go around here." Ezra sat at a corner table, eyes scanning the room. A few other patrons sat scattered across the cafe, their faces shadowed in the dim light, not speaking. They simply stared ahead, as if lost in their own thoughts. The hum of a radio played softly in the background, but it too seemed muted, distant. It wasn't the usual comforting buzz of life. It was something strange, something unsettling. "Can I get you something?" the woman asked, her voice suddenly colder. "Just some coffee," Ezra replied. "I'm new here, just moved in." "Ah." She set down the rag and walked over to prepare his coffee, her movements slow and deliberate. "Hesperus isn't much for newcomers. It's not the kind of place you can shake off your past in." Her voice was low, as if she were talking more to herself than to him. "But you'll learn soon enough." She paused for a beat. "The sound gets to everyone." Ezra frowned, trying to mask his discomfort. "Sound?" The woman nodded without looking. "Up. You'll hear it soon enough." She handed him a mug, her hands thin and gnarled with age. "It's always there, that hum. It never stops, but you'll get used to it. It's not the kind of thing that goes away. We all have our noise." She leaned in, her voice quieter now, almost conspiratorial. "Some of us, we listen too closely. That's when things start changing." "Like what?" Ezra asked, his voice betraying his curiosity despite himself. The woman sighed, casting a quick glance toward the window as if checking for something. "You'll see, or maybe you won't. You'll hear things. People who aren't there. Whispers when no one's around. It gets worse, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "It's been like this for years. Can't leave. Can't escape. The sound has a way of keeping us here." Ezra stared at her, his stomach tightening. "It's just old radios, right? Static? Old radios, yeah." She didn't meet his gaze. "But not just that. It's the hum that gets in your bones. It's a part of this place. The past is buried in that sound, and it knows what you've done, what you haven't done, what you're running from." A cold shiver ran down Ezra's spine. The mention of running sent his thoughts spiraling back to the accident. The way Theo's laughter had been swallowed by the screech of tires, the sudden silence after the crash. He had never stopped running. "I think you might be mistaken," Ezra said, his voice steady, but filled with an unease that he couldn't shake. "I'm just here to get away. No ghosts, no echoes." The woman's lips twitched into a thin, bitter smile. "No one ever believes it's the sound until they hear it for themselves." As she turned to walk away, Ezra felt his skin prickle with the weight of her words. He looked down at the mug in front of him, trying to force himself to concentrate on the warmth it offered. The coffee had a strange aftertaste, bitter and sharp, but it didn't matter. The hum of the town, the hum that had been so faint at first, seemed to crawl under his skin now. It felt like a distant whisper, like a pulse that had no beginning or end, just an infinite rhythm. Suddenly he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The shadows in the cafe had grown deeper, the air thicker. He turned, scanning the room for any sign of movement, but the people around him remained still, unmoving. Their eyes seemed distant, hollow, as if they were part of the same silence that stretched beyond the walls. "Can I help you?" The woman's voice interrupted his thoughts, a polite but uninviting tone. Ezra blinked, realizing he had been staring at the empty cup in front of him for too long. "No, I'll pay and leave." He stood, feeling the weight of his own unease. He didn't belong here. But as he walked out of the cafe, the door creaked behind him, and that's when he heard it. A low, almost imperceptible hum, like a static charge in the air. He paused, glancing over his shoulder, but there was no one behind him, no source for the sound. The hum felt familiar. It was the same hum that had started when he held the necklace in his hands. His hand went to his pocket, where the pendant now lay heavy, pulsing in rhythm with the sound that seemed to be coming from all around him. As the fog enveloped him once more, Ezra's heart skipped a beat. The hum was not just in the town. It was inside him now, and he couldn't escape it. The day passed slowly, as if time itself had slowed to match the endless fog that enveloped Hesperus. Ezra wandered through the empty streets, trying to familiarize himself with the town's ghostly rhythm, but every step seemed to echo too loudly in the silence. The people here moved like shadows, slow, deliberate, but never engaging. It wasn't as if they were ignoring him. It was as if they didn't see him at all. The hum was still there, lurking just beneath the surface of the day. It had grown faint, almost imperceptible during the daylight hours, but Ezra could feel it deep in his bones. Like an itch that couldn't be scratched, it rattled at the edges of his mind. The necklace in his pocket seemed to throb in time with the sound, a low pulse that set his nerves on edge. By evening, the town had become even more suffocating. The fog thickened, settling heavier, as if the sky itself was drowning. The streets were barely visible, and the gas lamps flickered dimly, casting long, wavering shadows against the crumbling brick walls. Ezra had spent the day exploring, but every corner seemed to bring him to another dead end, more abandoned houses, more vacant windows. The town felt as if it were dying, not with a bang, but with a slow, agonizing whimper. His unease reached a breaking point, and he found himself standing in front of the town's old church. It had been abandoned for years, the doors hanging ajar, the paint peeling from the walls. Something about it called to him, like a whisper in the fog. The building, once a place of faith and sanctuary, had long since fallen into neglect. Yet, as Ezra approached, he felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability, like something was waiting for him inside. The door creaked open as he stepped forward, the air heavy with dust and the smell of mildew. The church's interior was dim, the sunlight barely piercing through the grime-covered windows. Rows of pews were empty and broken, their cushions worn to the bone. The floor was scattered with debris, and the altar stood at the far end, shrouded in shadow. A single candle burned, its flame dancing in the breeze that slipped through the cracked walls. Ezra hesitated at the threshold, unsure whether he should enter. But something deep inside urged him forward, as if the church itself was calling him, pulling him closer to something he wasn't ready to understand. He stepped inside, his boots echoing against the cold stone floor. The hum, the same hum that had followed him since his arrival, seemed to grow louder here, vibrating through the walls and under his feet. It was almost as if the building itself was alive, resonating with a frequency that had been dormant for years. He moved deeper into the church, his heart pounding in his chest. His eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of life, but all he found were the remnants of a place long abandoned. His footsteps carried him toward the altar, where a set of old, crumbling radios sat scattered on the ground, their cords tangled like forgotten relics of a bygone era. They were old-fashioned, outdated even by the standards of the time. Their metal frames had rusted, their glass faces cracked. Yet as Ezra approached, he felt a strange pull toward them. Something about these radios felt significant, like they were more than just broken machines. They had been here for a reason. His hand hovered over one of the radios, the sound intensifying in his ears. The hum was now a constant buzz, like static, but distorted, warped somehow. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. The instant he touched it, the sound shifted. It grew louder, sharper, and for a moment it seemed to consume the entire church, drowning out everything else. Ezra staggered back, his heart racing as the hum reverberated in his skull, like 1,000 voices whispering in a language he couldn't understand. Suddenly the static cut off, leaving a profound silence in its wake. The air felt heavy, as if the world itself had taken a breath and held it. Ezra's pulse quickened. He turned toward the door, ready to leave, but something stopped him. A voice, barely audible, seeped through the stillness. Ezra. His body went rigid. The voice, it sounded like Theo. He spun around, but there was no one there, only the empty pews and the shadows that stretched across the floor. Ezra. The voice came again, clearer now, and it filled the church, echoing in the empty space, like a bell tolling for the dead. His name, distorted and stretched, came from every corner, from the radios, from the walls, from the very air around him. His breath caught in his throat. This couldn't be happening. Not again. The pain, the grief, washed over him like a tidal wave. His hand gripped the necklace in his pocket, and for a moment, the hum intensified again. A thrum that seemed to pulse in his chest. "Where are you?" the voice asked, trembling in the silence. "I'm waiting for you, Ezra." His legs shook, and he took a step back. "No," he whispered, "this isn't real. It's just a trick, a hallucination." But the hum, the voice, wouldn't let him go. He couldn't breathe. The sound was suffocating, twisting around him like a net closing in. The radios on the floor flickered, their broken dials turning on their own, as though they were alive, reaching for him. "Help me, Ezra," the voice pleaded. a desperate sob breaking through the static. "I can't hear you anymore." He stumbled, backward, his back hitting the church's cold stone wall. His heart was pounding, and the room seemed to tilt, as if the very foundation of the church was shifting beneath him. The air was thick, stifling, and Ezra couldn't get enough breath. His mind raced. What was happening? What was real? He turned to flee, but as he ran toward the door, he was met by an overwhelming sense of dread. The door, which had once been ajar, was now slammed shut, trapping him inside. He pounded on the wood, but it wouldn't budge. The hum was deafening now, ringing in his ears, his thoughts scattering until all he could hear was the voice. Ezra. And then everything stopped. The door creaked open on its own. Ezra stumbled outside, gasping for air, the fog rolling in once more. The church loomed behind him, its silhouette barely visible in the thick mist. But the hum was gone. For a moment, there was only silence. The fog had swallowed the sound, as if it had never been there at all. His breath was ragged, his chest aching, but Ezra knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The town of Hesperis wasn't just cursed by its history. It was haunted by something darker, something that knew him, something that was waiting for him to listen, and Ezra couldn't escape it. The following days were a blur of unease and restless searching. Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that the church, that room with its forgotten radios and suffocating hum, had changed something within him. The sound had lingered in his ears. Long after he had left, the voice of his brother still echoing in the corners of his mind. He couldn't escape it, no matter how far he tried to run. It was as if the town itself was shifting, warping, pulling him deeper into something he didn't understand. The fog had thickened again, pressing against his windows, filling the streets with an unnatural heaviness. The constant, oppressive quiet of the town had become unbearable, but Ezra found no refuge in the isolation he had sought. It was suffocating. Every time he stepped outside, the air felt too thick, as if it was closing in on him. The hum from the necklace had grown louder in his pocket, a persistent pulse that matched the rhythm of his own heart. His nerves were on edge, his mind fraying at the edges, and yet something inside told him that the answers were here. They were buried in Hesperis, hidden just beneath the surface. He couldn't ignore it any longer. That afternoon, he found himself once again at the library, the place that had become his only sanctuary from the town's ever-encroaching darkness. Dahlia Rourke had been a quiet presence there, an enigma. She had told him to leave the past alone, to leave the town alone. But her cryptic warnings only seemed to draw him deeper into the mystery. He couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something important. Ezra approached the counter where Dahlia sat, her fingers tracing over a book, her eyes distant. Her usual calm demeanor seemed worn, as though the town's quiet torment was wearing her down too. "Dahlia," Ezra began, his voice low, "I need to know more about Hesperis, about its history." Dahlia looked up at him, her expression unreadable. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, as if considering whether to answer. Finally, she nodded and gestured toward a section of the library that Ezra hadn't noticed before, tucked away in the back behind a stack of dusty old books. "There's a collection of town archives back there," she said. "Most of it's been forgotten or ignored by the newer generation. But I can tell you've been hearing things, seeing things. If you want to understand it, you'll have to know what happened here." Ezra's pulse quickened. He followed her lead, moving into the shadowy corner where old, yellowing books lined the shelves. The smell of old paper and dust filled the air, thick and earthy. The shelves seemed to stretch on forever, and as he ran his fingers over the spines of the books, it was as though the entire room whispered secrets too ancient to fully comprehend. Dahlia handed him a small leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. The title on the front was barely legible, but it seemed to read "The Sound of Hesperus." Ezra flipped it open, his heart racing as he scanned the pages. The text was cramped, handwritten in a hurried scrawl that felt urgent, desperate even. "Is this..." Ezra hesitated. "Is this about the town's curse?" Dahlia didn't answer immediately. She merely watched him, her eyes distant as if she could feel the weight of the journal's contents bearing down on him. "It's more than a curse," she said quietly. "It's a ritual, a long-forgotten one. The founders of Hesperus were obsessed with sound. They believed it was the key to opening doors to other realms, realms where time and space didn't exist, where grief and memory could be controlled. The town's foundation was built on the manipulation of sound." Ezra's breath caught in his throat. A ritual? What kind of ritual? Dahlia motioned for him to sit, her hands trembling slightly as she flipped through the pages of the journal. "They used sound to manipulate the dead," she explained, "to summon them, to ask them questions. They believed that the human mind could not perceive the full spectrum of sound, that there were frequencies hidden just beyond our awareness, frequencies that could unlock the veil between life and death. They recorded their rituals in these journals, every detail, every frequency, every chant." She paused, her gaze distant. "But it didn't work as they expected. The ritual went wrong. Something was awakened, something dark. It was tied to grief, to loss. And ever since, the town has been haunted by the echoes of those mistakes." Ezra felt his heart pound. The necklace in his pocket thrummed in response, its hum matching the eerie beat of his pulse. He closed the journal, the weight of its knowledge pressing down on him. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture they formed was more terrifying than he had ever imagined. This town, this place, wasn't just cursed by its history, it was haunted by it. The sound, the hum, it was all part of something much bigger, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him. And Theo, Ezra's voice was barely a whisper. "How does he fit into all of this?" Dahlia's face softened and she shook her head slowly. "I don't know, but I think he's part of it. You've been hearing his voice, haven't you?" Ezra's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "You're not the first to hear it," Dahlia said quietly. "The sound calls to those who have lost something, the ones who can't move on. Your brother, Ezra, he's trapped here, just like the rest of them. The sound, it pulls people in. And once it has you, once it gets inside your head, it doesn't let go." She took a deep breath, her hands clasping the edges of the counter. "The sound feeds on grief. It feeds on the pain of the living, and the dead are drawn to it. The longer you stay here, the more it will eat at you until there's nothing left. That's how it was for the town's founders, and that's how it will be for you." Ezra swallowed hard. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and he felt a strange chill creeping down his spine. He had come to Hesperus to escape, his past to forget about Theo. But now he realized he had never truly left. The town wasn't just a place, it was a prison, a tomb where the past refused to stay buried. Dahlia's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's more, Ezra. There's a way to stop it, but it's dangerous. You'll have to face the truth about what happened. You'll have to confront the sound head on, but..." She paused, her expression darkening. "I'm afraid that once you do, it may already be too late." Ezra's fingers tightened around the journal in his hands. He knew what he had to do, but fear gnawed at him like an animal in the dark. And as he left the library, the hum from his brother's necklace grew louder, resonating in his chest with each step, like an unrelenting drumbeat, pulling him toward the truth, pulling him toward whatever it was that waited in the shadows. The days blurred into one another, each one indistinguishable from the last, as if the fog that enveloped Hesperus had seeped into the fabric of time itself. Ezra was running out of places to hide, his mind plagued by the ever-growing hum that seemed to follow him everywhere. The town's oppressive silence, once a welcome reprieve, had become a prison. The necklace in his pocket throbbed with a low, persistent vibration, a constant reminder that his past was never truly behind him. The hum was no longer just an annoying sound. It had become a presence, something alive and breathing, something that refused to be ignored. Ezra tried to focus, to make sense of the fragmented pieces of the town's cursed history that Dahlia had given him. But the more he dug, the deeper the hole seemed to become. Every journal he read, every scrap of information he uncovered, only made the situation more unclear. The sound, the hum, wasn't just a product of the town's past. It was a living, breathing entity, something tied to the fabric of Hesperus itself. And as Dahlia had warned him, it fed on grief. It fed on him. It was feeding on the unresolved guilt he carried for Theo's death. He had returned to the church again and again, unable to resist the pull. The radios, those broken relics of the town's forgotten rituals, had become an obsession. He needed to understand what they had been used for. He needed to know if there was a way to stop the sound, to stop the thing that was haunting him. But each time he stepped into the church, the hum grew louder, more intense, until it felt like his skull might crack open from the pressure. Tonight, it was different. He felt it in the air. The pressure had shifted, as if something was waiting. Something was about to break. Ezra stood in front of the church, staring at the crumbling stone steps, unsure whether he was afraid or compelled. He had come to the realization that he was no longer simply dealing with a town trapped in the past. The town was alive with memory, with sound, and it wanted him to listen. The door creaked open on its own, and Ezra stepped inside, his breath catching as the familiar hum washed over him like a cold wave. The church felt colder than it had before, its air thick with dust and decay. The dim light from the broken stained glass windows cast warped shadows across the floor, and the pews, empty and abandoned, seemed to watch him silently. The radios were in their usual spot, discarded in a corner like forgotten toys. But tonight, something was different. The air around them shimmered, as if they were charged with an unseen energy. Ezra's heart raced as he approached them, his hands trembling. He could feel it. The sound was growing stronger, louder. He knelt beside the radios, his fingers brushing over their cold, rusted surfaces. There were 4 of them now, and as his hands hovered over them, the air seemed to thrum with the same rhythm as the hum in his chest. They were calling to him. Ezra hesitated for a moment, then turned the dial on the nearest radio. The static exploded into a deafening roar, filling the church with a shrill, high-pitched screech that made his teeth rattle in his skull. His head spun as the sound overwhelmed him, pressing in on all sides. His vision blurred and he stumbled back, his heart thundering in his chest. The hum, the low, rhythmic hum, joined the static, deep and resonant, almost like a heartbeat. It vibrated through the floorboards, shaking the very air around him. Ezra. The voice came again, distorted by the static. But this time, it wasn't just Theo's voice. It was different. It was as if the sound had taken on a life of its own, warping and twisting the voices of the dead, pulling them from the void. The voice grew clearer, sharper. It was calling to him, beckoning him forward, urging him to listen, to understand. The church seemed to bend around him, the walls warping, as if the very building were being consumed by the sound. His breath quickened, his pulse pounding in his ears as the voice grew louder. It wasn't just Theo anymore. It was every person who had ever been lost to the sound, every soul who had been swallowed by the curse of Hesperus. "Help me, Ezra," the voice cried, now unmistakably his brother's. "I'm still here. You can save me. You have to listen." The sound was unbearable now, the radios wailing in unison, drowning out everything else. The church around him began to collapse. the ceiling groaning as if it were being torn apart. Ezra's legs gave way, and he fell to his knees, clutching his head as the sound surged through him like a wave. It was suffocating. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The pain in his chest was overwhelming, his heart threatening to burst under the pressure. And then, in the midst of the chaos, there was a sudden silence, a heavy, oppressive silence that filled the church like a thick fog. Ezra's body trembled as he forced himself to his feet, staring at the radios. The hum had faded, but something else lingered in the air. Something darker. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The church was still there, but it felt different, as if the very foundation of it had shifted. Something had changed. He had crossed a threshold, and now there was no going back. He stumbled forward, his body moving on instinct, and he reached for the nearest radio. This time, when he turned the dial, there was no static, no hum, just a voice. A low, familiar voice. "I'm waiting for you, Ezra." His breath caught in his throat. It was Theo, but this time it wasn't distorted. It was clear. It was real. "Come back to me." The world around him seemed to warp and bend. The walls of the church closing in on him, the floor beneath his feet shifting like sand. He was drowning in the sound, suffocating in the weight of it, and he knew deep down that it wasn't just his brother's voice that he was hearing. It was the sound of the town itself, of the past that refused to stay buried. With shaking hands, Ezra turned off the radio. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with a new weight, a new presence. The hum was still there, barely perceptible, but it was there, and Ezra could feel it resonating through the floor, through his chest. The walls had cracked. The veil between life and death had been torn open, and now there was no way to close it again. The night had fallen with a quiet finality, the kind of stillness that pressed against your skin, turning every breath into an effort. Ezra sat in his small living room, staring at the remnants of the day, an old notebook, half-formed sketches of the town's layout, the journal Dahlia had given him, and the necklace that had begun to feel like an anchor rather than a relic. The hum from the pendant, faint but persistent, vibrated against his ribs, reminding him that he was being pulled deeper into something he couldn't comprehend, something that felt alive, almost sentient. It was no longer just a sound. It was an invitation. He had spent the last few days reading more of the town's history, piecing together the fragments Dahlia had shared. It was like watching a puzzle come together, but instead of a clear picture, the image that emerged was grotesque and shifting, a world where grief was currency and sound was the key to everything, life, death, and beyond. The more he learned, the more entangled he became, each discovery tightening the noose of inevitability around his throat. Ezra's mind circled back to his brother, his loss, his guilt, the accident, the voice that had called to him from the radios. His brother's voice, now unmistakable, as though the sound itself had somehow conjured him from the dark recesses of the past. The echo of his brother's plea wasn't just a remnant of grief, it was a tether, something deeper. The more he tried to silence it, the louder it became. Was it truly Theo speaking, or was it the sound, the town, feeding on his guilt? He stood, abruptly, knocking over the half-empty coffee cup in the process. The hot liquid splashed across the table, but Ezra paid it no mind. His gaze was fixed on the wall opposite him. There, where a small, framed photograph of Theo hung, now blurred by the growing mist that seeped from the cracks of the house. He hadn't noticed it before, but it was there. His brother, smiling, untouched by the weight of the world that had come after. It was a reminder of a time before the crash, before everything changed. A sudden chill swept through the room, and with it came a sound, so faint that it could have been a whisper in the wind or a crack in the floorboards. But it wasn't either of those. It was the hum, rising like a tide beneath the house. Ezra's hand flew to his pocket, where the necklace was buried, its pulse sinking with his frantic heartbeat. His breath quickened. This was no longer just about the past. This was about the present, the weight of his choices, and the place he had found himself trapped in. With a growing sense of inevitability, Ezra grabbed his coat and headed toward the door. He couldn't keep running. The answers lay in the church. They had to. The fog had thickened again as he stepped outside, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across the wet pavement. The town felt colder now, as if it were waiting for something, waiting for him. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that gnawed at your nerves until even the smallest sound became unbearable. The hum grew louder as he walked, filling his skull with a resonating throb. It was coming from the church, he could feel it. The sound had drawn him in before. This time, there would be no turning back. As he approached the church, the door, still slightly ajar from the last time he entered, swung open of its own accord, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, but underneath that, there was something darker, something pressing on his chest. The hum was constant now, an omnipresent force, vibrating through the very walls of the church. He could feel it under his feet, in his fingertips, in his bones. The radios were still where he had left them, cluttered in a heap by the altar. But tonight they seemed different. The metal frames were covered in a fine layer of dust, and yet the air around them was charged. Ezra's heartbeat quickened as he stepped closer. The radios were no longer just machines. They were something else, something alive. Without thinking, his hands reached out, his fingers brushing over the radios, their surfaces cool and unyielding. The hum reverberated, drawing him in. His breath hitched as he reached for the nearest radio. It was the largest of them, its surface cracked and worn, its dial frozen on a single point. He twisted it slowly, and the air in the church thickened, the pressure rising as the static built. For a moment, the static was all-encompassing, deafening, and then, through the roar, a voice emerged, clear as day. Ezra. His chest tightened. The sound of his brother's voice, unmistakable. It was raw, filled with desperation, but there was something else, something more primal, something darker. The static swirled around it, distorting the words as it merged with the hum that had filled the church. "Help me," Theo's voice pleaded. But it wasn't just a plea, it was a command. "You have to listen." Ezra's hand trembled, his knuckles white as he gripped the radio tighter, trying to turn the dial again, but it wouldn't budge. The voice came again, louder this time, growing in intensity. "Listen to the sound." The words were no longer his brother's, but something deeper, something ancient, rising from the cracks in the church, from the very foundations of Hesperus itself. The radios began to crackle and spark, their static building into a crescendo. Ezra stumbled back, his head pounding as the room seemed to close in around him. The hum surged in volume, a violent pulse that felt like it was coming from every direction, warping the walls, warping his very perception. His breath quickened, his vision starting to blur. He felt the ground beneath him tremble, as though the church itself was alive, breathing, responding to the call of the sound. Suddenly, the room shifted. The walls stretched, distorted, as if reality itself was tearing at the seams. Shadows moved, but they weren't shadows. They were figures, familiar but distorted, twisted by the sound. Faces emerged from the static, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. These were not just memories. They were fragments of those who had been lost, those who had been consumed by the sound, trapped in this eternal echo. Ezra's pulse thundered in his ears. The hum was overwhelming now, a physical force that pressed down on him, a presence that was suffocating him. His mind screamed, but the voice inside his head, the sound, drowned it out. It was pulling him under, dragging him into the very heart of the town's curse. "You have to listen, Ezra." The voice came again, now unmistakably Theo's. But it wasn't just his brother's voice anymore. It was the voice of the town, of the sound itself, reaching through the veil between life and death. The static grew deafening, and Ezra fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head as the sound consumed him. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The hum, the voices, the static, they all fell silent in an instant. Ezra gasped for breath, his body trembling. The room was still, the air thick with an unsettling quiet. The radios were dead again, their static reduced to nothing more than the faintest whisper. But something had shifted. The veil had been torn, and now the truth lay before him, in fragments and echoes. He had listened, and the sound had taken him deeper into the web of Hesperis. As he stood, dizzy and disoriented, a chilling realization crept over him. He had crossed the line. The sound was no longer something that could be controlled. It was feeding on him. It was feeding on his guilt, and now it knew him. "You can't escape, Ezra," the voice whispered one last time, fading into the silence. Ezra stumbled backward, his heart racing. The truth was clear now. There was no escaping the sound, and it was only just beginning. Ezra didn't return to the church that night. He couldn't. The weight of what had just transpired, his brother's voice, the static, the horrifying figures that had appeared from the shadows, had left him gasping for air, both mentally and physically. He had tried to flee the sound, but it had followed him, burrowing itself deeper into his mind. The silence that had descended upon the church after the last pulse of static only made things worse. It felt like a calm before a storm. The sound wasn't gone. It was only waiting. The walk back to his house had been an ordeal. The fog, now thicker than ever, pressed down on him like an invisible weight. The town was silent, but there was something in that silence that gnawed at his sanity. The streets, the houses, even the trees seemed to be watching him. Each step he took, he could feel the hum growing stronger, filling the air with an invisible pressure. It was like a shadow, lurking just beneath the surface of the world, waiting for him to acknowledge it. Inside his house, Ezra sank into an armchair, trying to steady his breathing. His hands shook as he reached for the necklace in his pocket. He couldn't avoid it anymore. The pendant had been a silent witness to everything that had happened, and now it felt alive in his palm, pulsating in rhythm with his racing heart. He closed his eyes, trying to clear his mind, but even in the quiet of his house, the hum was there. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, a low vibration that seemed to echo through his very bones. It had become an undeniable presence in his life, a thing that couldn't be ignored any longer. He couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was growing more powerful, feeding off his fear, his guilt, his grief. And then he heard it, a sharp crack, a distortion in the hum. At first, Ezra thought it was his mind playing tricks on him, but the sound became unmistakable. It was an object falling, a sharp, metallic sound. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls like a distorted alarm. He shot up from his chair, heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what had caused it, but he couldn't ignore it. Something was happening. He stepped cautiously toward the source of the noise. The living room, usually untouched, was now the epicenter of a strange magnetic pull. The furniture had shifted slightly, but it was the wall opposite him that caught his attention. Something had changed. There, embedded in the wall, was a strange symbol, a sigil scratched into the surface. The markings were jagged and uneven, as though carved hastily by someone desperate, someone who had no time to think, only to act. Ezra's breath caught in his throat. It was the same symbol he had seen in the journals, the ones from the town's founders, the ones linked to the ritual. But how? How had it appeared here, in his home? His mind raced with questions, but before he could process them, the hum intensified. It had shifted, now a piercing frequency that cut through his skull, leaving his thoughts in disarray. It wasn't just a noise anymore, it was a signal, a loud, distorted voice blasted through the air, cutting through the hum. "Help me!" The voice wasn't Theo's this time. It was different, distorted, broken. The sound felt like it was coming from inside the walls, deep within the structure of the house itself. Ezra staggered backward, his head spinning as the voice grew louder, its tone desperate and frantic. "You have to listen to me," the voice pleaded. "You're running out of time." Ezra's hands shook as he reached for his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was futile. The sound was everywhere, reverberating in the walls, the floor, the ceiling. His skin tingled as the vibration of it seeped into him, making his muscles ache. His body wanted to collapse under the pressure, but something inside him refused to give in. He had to understand what was happening. He had to know what the sound wanted. Through the chaos, the voice continued. "The sound is coming. You have to stop it before it's too late." The walls shuddered as if they too were alive, responding to the voice. The house groaned and creaked, its foundation rattling as though something was stirring beneath the surface. The air was thick now, swirling with a pressure that was almost tangible, like something was trying to break through from the other side. In a sudden flash of clarity, Ezra understood. This wasn't just the sound of grief. This wasn't just the hum of the town. It was something else, something darker, older, something that had been awakened when he arrived. It was drawing him in, pulling him deeper into the web of Hesperus, and if he didn't stop it, it would consume him, just like it had consumed the others. Ezra stumbled toward the door, his heart pounding as the walls closed in around him. He had to leave. He had to escape. The sound was no longer something he could just ignore. It had already claimed the town. It had already claimed his brother. And now, it was coming for him. But as he reached for the door handle, the world around him shifted again. The air thickened, and the temperature dropped suddenly, sending a chill down his spine. The walls were closing in on him, the space around him warping. The door wouldn't open. He pulled harder, but it wouldn't budge. The house was locked in place, its structure suddenly rigid, its walls alive with the energy of the sound. "You can't escape," the voice echoed one last time, clearer than before. "You have to listen. You have to face it." Ezra's chest constricted as the sound reached a fever pitch, vibrating the very bones in his body. It was everywhere now, inescapable. It was no longer just a sound. It was the essence of Hesperus. It was the town's curse, its heartbeat, its soul. And Ezra was its next victim. With a final desperate cry, Ezra pushed against the door with all his strength, but it didn't move. It didn't give. And then, everything stopped. The silence was absolute, suffocating. Ezra stood frozen, his hand still gripping the door handle. He could feel the weight of the house pressing in on him, but there was no sound, not even the hum, just an endless, oppressive stillness. For a moment, he thought he had gone deaf. But the silence didn't last. A new sound began, one that was different from everything before. It was faint at first, a rustling like dry leaves moving in the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was footsteps. Someone, something, was walking toward him from within the house, and it was coming for him. The silence in Ezra's house was suffocating. The air felt too thick, pressing in around him like a living thing. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his pulse pounding in his ears as the sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. He couldn't see anything, nothing that could explain the noise, but he could feel it. He could feel the presence, something just out of reach, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to escape before whatever was coming for him could reach him. But the door remained shut, the handle cold and unyielding under his hand. The house felt more like a trap than a sanctuary now. The walls closing in, the hum of the sound lingering beneath everything like an unseen hand squeezing the life out of him. The footsteps stopped just behind him. Ezra spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. But the room was empty. The fog had thickened outside the windows, and the pale light of the street lamps barely cut through the gloom. The oppressive stillness that had filled the house moments ago had given way to an eerie calm, a quiet so deep that it felt like the world itself had paused, holding its breath. But there was something else, something that sent a chill skittering up Ezra's spine. The air had shifted. The sound, the hum, was different now. It wasn't just a static, ever-present pulse anymore. It had changed in frequency, deepening, like the air itself was vibrating, in sympathy with whatever was moving inside the house. He could feel it in his bones, in the tips of his fingers, in the marrow of his legs as they trembled beneath him. The hum wasn't just coming from the town anymore. It was inside the house, inside him, reverberating through the very foundation. He turned toward the source of the footsteps, but nothing was there. Dahlia, Ezra whispered hoarsely, feeling the need for connection, for someone who might understand. This madness, but the word was swallowed by the silence. Dahlia, who had warned him about this. Dahlia, who had told him that the sound could consume him. Was it already too late for her to help him? Was she lost to it already? He thought of her pale face, her quiet eyes filled with knowledge and fear, and he wondered just how much of the truth she had been hiding from him. There was a sudden noise behind him, an exhale, deep and ragged. It wasn't his own. He whirled around, every muscle locked in terror, his breath caught in his throat. And then from the corner of the room, from the darkest shadow where the light from the window couldn't reach, something moved. It was a shape, but not fully formed. It was there and not there, a distortion in the air like a figure caught in a reflection too distant to truly touch. The shadows seemed to twist around it, feeding it, melding with it. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a thing. It was an absence, a gap in reality itself that Ezra couldn't quite understand, but that he knew, deep down, was something that had been drawn to him. The figure shifted again, coming closer, its presence warping the air, making the very room feel like it was bending, shifting, unraveling at the edges. And through the silence, Ezra heard something else, something he couldn't explain, but that he understood all too well. Theo's voice. It was distorted now, more of a cry than a whisper, a sound that shouldn't exist in the air. The voice cracked, as if struggling to form itself. "Ezra, why didn't you save me?" The words were sharp, accusing. His brother's voice, distorted, broken, tangled with grief. It sounded so real, so present, but it wasn't. It couldn't be. Ezra had seen what had happened to Theo. He had felt the crushing weight of the guilt every day since the accident. The pain of loss had never truly left him. But hearing that voice again from the shadows twisted everything inside of him. It was like a wound had been reopened, raw and bleeding. The figure moved forward again, and this time it was clearer, more defined. Ezra could make out the shape of a man, but not his face. The man's outline shifted like smoke, but the figure's presence was undeniable. His breath quickened as his feet stumbled backward, but the house seemed to press in from all sides. The door still wouldn't open. The space around him seemed smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were trapping him. Suddenly, there was another voice, This one unfamiliar, but still as chilling. It rose from the darkness behind the figure, low and gravelly, but unmistakably human. It was distorted, an echo, but its presence was undeniable. "He can't save you, Ezra," the voice rasped, pulling at the edges of his consciousness. "Not now. You are already ours." Ezra froze, the blood in his veins turning to ice. The figure, this thing, this presence, wasn't Theo. It wasn't any of the people he had lost. It was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting for him. Something tied to the sound, to the curse of Hesperis. He couldn't run from it, couldn't escape it. It was already inside him, twisting his memories, his emotions, warping everything he thought he knew about his past. His guilt, his grief. "You're too far gone," the voice continued, now clearer, louder. It was unmistakable now. The voice of the town, of the entity that had been pulling him deeper and deeper into its web. The figure took another step forward, and this time, Ezra could see its face. It was his own, not fully, but distorted, stretched, and twisted in a grotesque parody of his features. His own eyes stared back at him, hollow, devoid of everything that had once made him human. It was a reflection of his guilt, his regret, the very thing that had opened the door to this nightmare. "No," Ezra whispered, the word barely audible as his mind scrambled to make sense of what was happening. "No, this isn't real." But the figure's smile, a twisted, mocking grin, only deepened as it stepped closer, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. It raised its hand, and Ezra saw the glint of something in its fingers, an object, something sharp, something familiar. He had seen it before, the symbol that had appeared on the wall of his house, the sigil, the town's curse carved into the fabric of reality itself. And then, in the corner of his vision, Ezra saw something move. It wasn't just the figure anymore. It wasn't just the distortion in the air. It was the walls themselves, the space, the fabric of reality, bending and warping, just like the symbol had been carved into the wall. The sound, the hum, was growing louder, suffocating the air, filling every space with a vibration so powerful, it made the room shudder. "You have to listen," the figure hissed. "You have to listen to what we've become." And in that moment, as the walls of the room seemed to close in on him, Ezra understood. The sound, the curse, it wasn't just a thing from the past. It was alive, an entity tied to this place, to his own grief, to his own guilt. It had fed on him, twisted him, and now it was taking shape, using his memories, his regrets to become something real. He wasn't just hearing the sound anymore. He was becoming the sound. "Listen, Ezra," the figure whispered one last time. "It's too late to escape." The walls cracked open, the figure lunged, and the sound swallowed him whole. The sound was no longer just an echo in Ezra's mind. It was the rhythm of his existence. Every moment, every breath he took was drowned in it. He could feel the hum vibrating through his skin, seeping into his bones, twisting through the very fibers of his being. It was inside him, a parasite that had burrowed deep, feeding off his fear and regret, growing stronger with every passing second. The figure, that twisted, grotesque version of himself, still lingered in the corner of his mind, its words reverberating, filling him with a suffocating sense of inevitability. The walls of his house had bent and cracked, the air thick with a sense of finality. There was no escape. There was nowhere to run. He had listened, and now the sound had claimed him. Ezra stumbled through his house, his legs trembling beneath him. The fog outside had crept even further into the house, swirling around his feet like a living thing. The air felt dense, like it was pressing in from all sides, suffocating him, making it harder to breathe. Every corner he turned, every step he took felt like it was pulling him deeper into the void. The house wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a part of the sound. It was alive. He tried to call out, to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the hum, disappearing into the thick, oppressive silence that had enveloped everything. There was no one to hear him, no one left to help him. He reached the door again, desperate to get out, to escape the suffocating grip of the sound. But when he grabbed the handle, it refused to budge. It felt like the door was alive, as if it were part of the same terrible force that was trying to consume him. The town, the house, the very air, everything was wrapped in it. And then, as if to confirm his worst fear, Ezra heard something, a voice. At first it was faint, distant and indistinct, but then it grew louder, sharper, as though it was coming from behind him. He turned, his eyes wide with terror, searching the room for any sign of what was happening. The figure, the one that had mirrored him, was gone, but the presence remained. The space was thick with an invisible weight. Ezra. The voice was weak, barely audible but unmistakable. It was Dahlia. The realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. His breath caught. Dahlia had warned him, but now she was calling out to him. He rushed through the house, each step dragging like wading through thick mud, his body heavy with the weight of something unseen and terrible. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he had to reach her. He had to know if she was still alive, if she was real, if this was all somehow real. When he reached the back door, he stopped dead in his tracks. The house wasn't just shifting, it was changing. The walls had begun to distort again, pulling inward like the mouth of a cavern, the space narrowing until it felt like the room was folding in on itself. The hum had reached a new pitch, one that seemed to rattle his teeth and curl in his stomach. It was unbearable, almost unbearable. Dahlia. He cried out, but the sound of his voice was lost in the cacophony of the hum. And then, through the blurring distortion, he saw her, standing in the middle of the room. She was there in the corner, her back to him, her shoulders slumped as if exhausted, as if the world itself had worn her down. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and hollow, but the expression on her face was one of sorrow, of regret. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. She was staring at something. No, someone standing in front of her, something Ezra couldn't see. Dahlia, he called again, but this time his voice didn't reach her. She didn't turn. The hum grew louder, pushing against his chest like a wave crashing against the shore. Ezra felt his stomach churn as the sound began to twist again, layering upon itself, growing more complex, more malignant. He closed his eyes for a moment, his hands pressed to his ears, but nothing stopped it. The world around him was vibrating, shifting. He could hear it in his skull now, in his chest, vibrating like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Dahlia, please, look at me. He was frantic now, his breath ragged. And then, in the silence that followed, her voice broke through. You didn't. Listen, Ezra. Ezra's heart froze as the words seemed to wrap around him, their weight suffocating. They weren't Dahlia's words, not entirely. Her voice had become distorted, warped by the hum, by the curse that had claimed the town. It wasn't the voice of the woman he had come to rely on. It was something else, something darker, something that was tied to the very essence of Hesperis. Dahlia, stop, he gasped, his voice breaking. You're still here, you're alive, you have to be... Her head turned slowly, and when her eyes met his, Ezra felt a cold rush of terror, unlike anything he'd ever known. Her pupils were black, empty voids, like dark holes in her soul. There was nothing there. Her expression was empty, hollow, devoid of everything that had made her human. And then she spoke again, but this time, the words were not her own. They came from somewhere deeper, from the hum itself. You are already ours. Ezra's knees buckled as a wave of dizziness hit him. The room around him began to spin, the walls warping, stretching outward, as though reality itself was folding in on itself. Dahlia's form wavered, flickering like a broken image on a television screen. Her voice, though distorted, became clear. "You were always meant to listen, Ezra," the voice said. "The sound claimed you the moment you arrived. You've been feeding it, just like everyone before you, just like your brother. And now, there's nothing left to do but listen." "Please," Ezra cried, but his words were swallowed by the rising, by the horrible, consuming sound that surrounded him from all sides. Dahlia's form collapsed in on itself, her body twisting and distorting until it was no longer human. It became an empty, shifting mass of shadows and echoes. And then, it was gone. She was gone. But the sound remained. Ezra staggered backward, his mind spinning. His body was shaking, his chest tight with fear. The voice, the sound, it wasn't just an entity anymore. It was a presence, something that had seeped into the very fabric of Hesperis. It was pulling him under, consuming everything in its path, and now it had taken Dahlia. And in that moment, Ezra knew the terrible truth. He wasn't just being haunted, he was being consumed. The first victim had fallen, but it wouldn't stop with her, not until it had him too. The house was still, but Ezra wasn't. His body trembled, his hands shaking uncontrollably as the last remnants of Dahlia's form disappeared into the overwhelming void of sound. Her figure had twisted and warped before his eyes, her humanity slipping away in an instant, like smoke vanishing into the air. Her screams, distorted by the hum, still echoed in his mind, a reminder of the inescapable fate that awaited him. Ezra staggered back, his heart racing, his thoughts fractured. Every breath felt like a struggle as the reality around him began to splinter, the walls of his house warping, bending, as though the very space itself was being consumed by the sound. The floor groaned beneath him, the ceiling rippling like water, and the fog outside pressed against the windows like a suffocating weight. It was as though the town itself was sinking into the ground, and with it, everything Ezra had known was collapsing into oblivion. His head spun, and he clutched at the nearest wall for support, his fingers digging into the peeling plaster. The hum was everywhere now, a constant low vibration that filled his ears, his skull, and everything in between. It had become part of him, just as it had become part of the town, part of the people who had been drawn into its grip. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was an entity, a living thing feeding on guilt, on loss, on grief. It had claimed Dahlia, it had claimed Theo, and now it was closing in on him. Why? Ezra whispered into the oppressive silence. His voice seemed tiny, insignificant against the deafening roar of the hum. He had no answers, no way out. The very world around him was splintering, falling apart, as though the sound was unraveling, the fabric of reality itself. He turned toward the window, desperate for some shred of normality, some glimpse of the world that had once been. But all he saw was fog. It had consumed the town entirely, swallowing it whole. The streets were indistinguishable from the sky, the buildings lost in the thick, swirling mist that hung like a living cloud. It was as if Hesperis had ceased to exist, and in its place there was nothing but the hum, the dark void where time and space had no meaning. Ezra's body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of it. The house, the town, his memories, all of it was bending, warping, twisting into something unrecognizable. There was no escape, no way out. The sound had already taken too much, and now there was nothing left but the inevitable collapse. He stumbled into the living room, his legs shaky and weak. The once familiar space had become alien, its walls trembling, its corners yawning like darkened mouths. His eyes flicked to the bookshelf, where the journal Dahlia had given him still lay. Open, the pages yellowed and fragile, covered in dust. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't not look at it. It was the only thing that might hold the key to understanding what was happening. What had happened? Ezra reached for it, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages, the fragile paper crinkling beneath his touch. The words, once a distant history, now felt alive, pulsing with an energy that matched the hum in the air. The more he read, the clearer it became. The founders of Hesperis had done this. They had opened a door that should have remained closed. They had tried to use sound to manipulate life and death, to harness the power of the unseen, to alter the course of reality itself. And now, the town was paying for it. The words seemed to blur as Ezra read them, the meaning of them slipping, just out of reach. The sound was more than a curse. It was a force, a dark ancient power that fed on human emotion, on grief, on sorrow, on regret. It had been fed for centuries, growing stronger, more powerful with every victim, every life it claimed. And now it had consumed him. The sound is the key, Ezra read aloud, his voice shaking as he turned the page. The sound opens the door. The door is a passage, a threshold between worlds. It pulls from the past, from memory, from loss. And once the door is open, there is no closing it. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The words were clear now, their meaning sinking in. The door was open. He had walked through it the moment he arrived in Hesperis. The moment he first heard the hum. There was no going back. He was part of it now, caught in the web of sound and memory, bound by the grief that had driven him here. The house seemed to groan beneath him, the walls shifting again, pulling him deeper into the void. The sound was louder now, an all-encompassing presence that wrapped around him, smothering him with its weight. It wasn't just in his ears anymore. It was in his mind, in his heart, in the very marrow of his bones. You can't escape, Ezra. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't Theo's voice anymore. It wasn't Dahlia's. It was the sound itself, the entity that had consumed them all. The walls of the house trembled as the voice echoed through the room, bending the very space around him. You're already part of it, the voice continued. You've already listened. You've already opened the door. And now you belong to the sound. Ezra's heart raced. His hands pressed to his ears, trying to block out the noise. But it was futile. The sound was inescapable, a living thing that had taken root inside of him. The walls of the house had become part of the sound, shifting with every pulse, every beat. The ground beneath him trembled again, and he fell to his knees, the air thick with the hum, the oppressive weight of it pushing down on him. Suddenly the room went dark. The walls, the ceiling, everything around him seemed to disappear, leaving only the sound, the pulsing hum that filled the space, that filled him. He gasped for breath, his hands clutching at his chest, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to hold on to. The darkness was absolute. It was as if the very fabric of reality had unraveled, leaving him in an endless void of sound. And then, a vision? No, a memory flashed before his eyes. It was a memory of Theo, of the day before the accident. They had been sitting together, laughing, talking about everything and nothing, their voices echoing in the empty house. Theo had been full of life, his smile infectious. It was the last time Ezra had seen him happy. And then, everything had gone wrong. The crash. The guilt hit him like a physical blow, the memory of that moment tearing through him. He had been too late. He hadn't been fast enough. He hadn't been there when Theo needed him most. And the sound had begun. The sound that had been with him since that day. The sound that had followed him, consuming him, feeding off his grief, Ezra's. Vision blurred, and he was pulled into the void again, the hum growing louder, the sound becoming an unbearable presence. It was more than just a memory now. It was his entire life, his every regret, every mistake, every unspoken word. It was feeding on him, twisting him, until there was nothing left but the sound. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the memory faded. Ezra was left alone in the dark, the hum still reverberating through him, through everything. His body was trembling, his mind shattered by the weight of it. There was no escape now. The sound had claimed him, the town had claimed him, and all that was left was the hum, echoing through the void. Ezra awoke with a start, his breath ragged and shallow. His body felt heavy, as though the weight of the world had been placed on top of him in the darkness. He could still hear it, the hum, that constant, relentless pulse that seemed to echo through his very being. It wasn't just an external sound anymore. It was within him, a part of him, as if his blood flowed in time with its rhythm. The vibration felt alive, consuming, stretching through the muscles in his legs, his arms, down into the marrow of his bones. It was a prison and a presence, something he could neither escape nor escape from. He looked around, disoriented, but found no answers. The room, his house, was indistinguishable from the haze of fog that pressed against the windows. There was no sunlight, no color. Everything was gray, suffocated by the mist, the shadows, the smothering silence. The walls themselves seemed to hum with the frequency, vibrating softly under his touch as he tried to steady himself against the old wooden table in the center of the room. The house felt different, but Ezra couldn't quite place why. It was as though the boundaries between his memories, his present, and the force that had been chasing him were beginning to erode, merging into one fractured existence. The hum filled his skull, and he pressed his hands to his temples in an attempt to drown it out. It had gotten louder, sharper. It was no longer just an oppressive backdrop to his thoughts. It was a call. Ezra had tried so many times to drown it out, to run from it, but now it was here, inescapable. He could feel the hum in every fiber of his being, inside his chest, his heart, his pulse. The town, the house, even the air around him had become part of the sound. He was trapped in it. And every time he thought he could find a way out, it only deepened its grip, drawing him closer. His mind flitted back to the figure he had seen, that monstrous distortion of himself. He shuddered, not wanting to remember the face that had smiled back at him with that twisted, mocking grin. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was a manifestation of everything he had buried, his guilt, his fear, his unresolved pain. That figure was a reflection of what had already happened and what was yet to come. Ezra staggered toward the door, his legs shaky as he moved. He had to leave. He couldn't stay in this place anymore. Every step he took seemed to increase the pressure on his chest, and as he reached for the doorknob, the world around him warped again. The door was locked. His hand shook violently as he tried to turn it, but the door refused to open, as if the house itself were rejecting him. His mind braced. The town had swallowed him whole. The house had changed, twisted by the same forces that had warped his memories, his very sense of self. Every corner of this place now felt alien, like the walls themselves had become instruments of the sound, shaping everything that was left. And then, in the stillness, the door behind him opened. Ezra spun, his heart pounding in his chest. But there was no one there. The door had opened on its own, the gap wide enough for a shadow to slip through, but nothing moved in the frame. He took a hesitant step toward it, his breath shallow, the hum vibrating in his skull, making it impossible to think clearly. Was it real? Was this just another distortion in his perception? Or was something or someone waiting for him? He stepped through the door. The moment he crossed the threshold, the air around him seemed to pulse, a wave of static rushing over him. The house stretched again, warping, shifting like an optical illusion. The walls bent inward, the floors tilted. Everything felt unstable, fractured. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, feeding off the very confusion that gnawed at him. The hum grew louder, reverberating beneath his feet, vibrating his spine as though it were trying to tear him apart from the inside. And then he saw her. Dahlia. She was standing at the end of the hallway, her back turned to him, her silhouette all blurred by the mist that curled through the walls. She was still wearing the same expression of quiet sorrow, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she stood motionless, as if waiting for something. "Dahlia!" Ezra's voice cracked as he called out to her, his feet moving toward her despite the growing terror clawing at his chest. "Dahlia, please, you have to help me." But she didn't turn. The sound intensified, filling every space around him, making his thoughts scatter like leaves in a storm. The hum turned into a howl, a piercing, unbearable screech that made his head spin. He felt like his body was being torn apart by the sound, pulled toward her, but each step he took felt heavier, as if the very air were resisting him. "Please," he begged again, his voice strained. "Don't..." But before he could finish the sentence, Dahlia's body jerked, her form flickering like a broken reflection in a shattered mirror. Her face twisted, and for a split second, he saw the empty, hollow eyes that had been there before, the ones that had stared at him with that empty, tortured gaze. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Ezra froze, his mind struggling to catch up with what he had seen. The hallway was empty now, and all that remained was the oppressive hum, louder than before, filling the space like a living thing. It felt as though the walls themselves had collapsed in on him, and all that was left was the noise, the sound, the void. He turned around, frantic now, looking for some way to escape, but every direction he looked seemed to lead to more shadows, more distortion. The room around him was tearing at the seams, reality itself beginning to crumble under the weight of the sound. And then it hit him. The truth he had been avoiding, the one he had tried to deny in every waking moment. The sound isn't just a curse. It's a prison. It wasn't just the town that was locked in its grip. It wasn't just the people. It was him. He had become part of it. He had opened the door, stepped into the threshold, and now there was no going back. The sound was no longer something he could escape. It was part of him, as inseparable as his breath. The walls groaned again, the house shuddering around him. Ezra's vision blurred, the edges of his reality warping further. His skin crawled as the air grew thick with the hum, and a deep, primal fear coiled in his chest. This was it. This was the end of everything. But then, through the broken world, around him something emerged, a figure. It wasn't Dahlia this time, nor was it Theo. It was something else entirely, something that had been waiting for him in the dark corners of his mind. Something that had always been there, buried beneath the grief, the pain, and the guilt. The figure was tall, dark, its form shifting, indistinct, like a shadow made of sound itself. And as it approached, Ezra heard it. Again, the voice. "It's too late, Ezra." The figure's form rippled, the sound pulsating from it, drawing closer, as if the darkness itself had come to claim him. And he realized then there was no escape. Ezra's chest heaved as he staggered away from the distorted figure that had haunted him in the collapsing space of his house. The walls were still shifting, breathing with the rhythm of the hum that now pulsed louder than ever. Each step he took felt like wading through thick fog, his movements sluggish and disjointed, like he was moving in slow motion. The door he had tried to leave through earlier was gone now, absorbed by the shifting walls. He could feel it. The town itself had devoured it. The house wasn't just an object anymore, it was a part of the sound. The two were indistinguishable, intertwined in ways that he couldn't comprehend. And the hum, the low, mournful tone that had first drawn him in, had changed. It had become deeper, more resonant, as though it were the beating heart of Hesperus itself, thumping and thrumming beneath the surface, beneath everything. Ezra staggered into the hallway, his eyes darting around for any sign of escape. He was desperate now, each breath like sandpaper against his throat. The figure, the shadow that had taken shape in the house, was still there somewhere. It had disappeared for a moment, but he knew it was only hiding, waiting for him to break. The house had become a labyrinth. The walls stretched and warped around him, the very structure of the building bending under the pressure of the sound. The doors had vanished, the windows shrouded in fog that seemed to pour in from the outside, thickening the air, making it harder to breathe. It wasn't just the house that had changed, everything was warping. The town was pulling at the edges of his mind, consuming him, dragging him deeper into its orbit. The hum was everywhere now, vibrating through him, wrapping around his thoughts like tendrils, squeezing the very essence of him until there was nothing left but the hum. "You can't run from this," the voice had told him. But now, for the first time, Ezra was beginning to wonder if it was telling the truth. He reached the staircase, the wooden steps creaking under his weight as he ascended them. The air was colder up here. The walls had become darker, the shadows thicker, as if the very essence of the house was drawing closer to him. The familiar had turned alien, and with each step, he felt himself slipping further into the unknown. The further he went, the more distorted everything became. The edges of reality began to bleed into each other, as if he was standing at the precipice of a dream. No, a nightmare that he couldn't wake from. There were no sounds except for the hum, the relentless hum, and the voice. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. "Ezra," the voice whispered again, soft but insistent. "Help me." It wasn't Theo's voice this time. It was faint, trembling, the echo of something else, something buried deep within the house, something desperate. It was a woman's voice, one Ezra recognized, but he couldn't place it. His steps faltered. He knew that voice. Dahlia. Ezra's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but it was enough. It carried through the thick fog of his mind. "Ezra?" Dahlia's voice came again, but now it was louder, clearer. It was filled with pain, filled with something that made Ezra's heart pound in his chest. He stumbled forward, moving down the hallway, but the sounds around him grew louder, more insistent. He could feel them pressing in on him, like fingers clawing at his skin, dragging him backward. He stopped in his tracks as the hum seemed to shift again. The walls flickered, warping in and out of focus, and the space ahead of him twisted like a funhouse mirror. Dahlia's voice was coming from beyond the door at the end of the hallway, faint but unmistakable. She was there. She had to be. But the room in front of him wasn't right. It wasn't the room he remembered. The door had become something else entirely, a warped version of itself. It pulsed with the hum, vibrating in time with the sound that seemed to move through everything now. "Ezra," the voice whispered again, this time closer, but still distorted. He reached for the door handle, his fingers trembling as he gripped it. The moment his fingers made contact, the hum exploded in volume, shaking the walls, sending a jolt of energy through his entire body. The door felt warm against his hand, alive, as though it were breathing, as though it were waiting for him to open it. The door swung open with a creak, and Ezra stepped into the room. But what he found wasn't Dahlia. It wasn't any version of the house he remembered. The room was empty, save for one thing, a mirror. It was an old, cracked mirror standing in the center of the room like a solitary sentinel. The glass was fogged, fractured, its edges jagged, and the reflection it offered was incomplete, warped in ways Ezra couldn't fully comprehend. The reflection wasn't of him. It wasn't of the room either. It was something else, something that had been waiting for him. He stepped closer, his heart pounding. The air grew thicker around him, the sound pressing in from all sides, drowning out every other thought. His reflection in the mirror was distorted, warped, just like everything else in this place. His face was stretched, eyes hollow, his mouth twisted in a silent scream. He reached out, his hand trembling, and the reflection in the mirror followed him. But as his fingers brushed against the glass, a chill ran down his spine. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else. Something that reached back toward him from the other side. Suddenly, the reflection began to move. It was Dahlia. Or at least it looked like Dahlia. Her face, like Ezra's, was distorted, twisted by the hum. She was pressing her hands against the mirror, her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror. But she wasn't looking at Ezra. She was looking past him, toward something else in the room, something that Ezra couldn't see. The air around him thickened. The hum began to crescendo, vibrating the very fabric of the room. Dahlia's reflection in the mirror screamed, her mouth stretching, her eyes bulging, and as Ezra watched in horror, she began to reach out toward him. "Dahlia!" he cried out, his voice cracking, but it was no use. She was beyond him now, lost to the mirror, lost to the sound. And in that moment, he realized with cold clarity that the mirror was not just a reflection. It was a portal, a doorway into something darker, something that had claimed her, just as it had claimed the town, just as it was now claiming him. The sound rose again, louder, more insistent. The mirror began to shimmer, the edges rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Dahlia's reflection was no longer still. She was pressing against the glass, her face contorted in a silent, tortured scream, and then, without warning, the glass shattered. Shards of the mirror exploded outward, filling the room with a deafening crash. Ezra barely had time to react before the shards began to vanish, absorbed by the sound itself. They were swallowed, absorbed into the very fabric of the room. And when the mirror had finally disappeared, so had Dahlia's reflection. But the hum remained, and it was louder than ever. Ezra looked around, his mind reeling. The room was empty now. No Dahlia, no mirror, just the sound. But something had changed, something had shifted. And the town, the house, the sound, they had all claimed another victim. Ezra could feel the weight of the house pressing against him. It had become something more than a structure. It was a living, breathing entity that surrounded him on all sides, twisting his perception of reality. The walls bent and warped like shifting shadows, and the air was thick with the hum, the pulse of something ancient and insidious, something that fed on grief, regret, and fear. Every step he took felt like wading deeper into an inescapable nightmare, where the rules of time and space no longer seemed to apply. The mirror's reflection had shattered, but its presence lingered. The distorted image of Dahlia, trapped on the other side of the glass, had etched itself into his mind. Her scream, her hands pressed against the mirror, still echoed in his ears. He could feel her pain, the weight of it pressing down on him, blending with his own grief, his own guilt. And then, the house had gone silent. Not the kind of silence that provides peace, but the kind that suffocates, the kind that makes you feel as though you're being swallowed by the darkness. Ezra felt the air shift around him, thickening, wrapping itself around him like a cocoon. The hum had faded, but its absence felt even more ominous. It was as though the world had stopped moving, as though time itself had come to a standstill in the silence. Ezra's thoughts turned inward, swirling around the memory of the night of the crash, of Theo's death, the night that had set him on this path, the night that had buried him in grief, the night he had failed. He closed his eyes, but the memory came rushing back, unbidden, sharp and painful. He had been there, just like he always had. Theo, his younger brother, had been more than just family. He had been Ezra's closest companion, his best friend, but that night something had changed. Theo had been laughing, joking about the plans they had for the future, teasing Ezra about his tendency to overthink everything. They had been driving home, heading down the winding roads, the kind that twisted through the trees, with the headlights, casting long shadows in front of them. Ezra had been so sure of the world then, so certain that nothing could go wrong. But when the tires had screeched against the pavement, when the car had veered off the road, everything had shattered in an instant. The crash had been a blur, a cacophony of sound, a spinning of metal and glass, a world upside down, and then the silence. The kind of silence that still haunted him, the kind of silence that had stretched on for days, weeks, months, the kind that followed him everywhere, wrapped itself around his thoughts until he couldn't breathe without hearing it. The silence that had only been broken by the hum. Ezra's breath quickened as the memory of that night flooded him once more. The flashing lights of the ambulance, the sound of his own voice screaming, begging for someone to help. The agonizing minutes before anyone arrived, when it had felt like the world had slipped away, and the only thing left was the terror in his heart. He had failed to save Theo. He had failed. The weight of that failure crushed him now, just as it had crushed him then. He had always been the one who looked out for Theo, who tried to keep him safe, who promised to protect him. But in the end, Ezra had been powerless. Theo was gone, and all that remained was the grief, the guilt, and now, the sound. Ezra's knees buckled beneath him, and he fell to the floor, clutching his head as if trying to stop the torrent of memories from drowning him. The walls around him seemed to close in, the air growing heavier, suffocating. The hum was gone, but the sense of doom remained, and with it, the echo of that night, the sound of Theo's voice, the sound of the crash, the sound of his failure. You didn't save me, Ezra. The voice came not from the air, but from within him. A whisper, a plea, a reproach that cut through the fog of his thoughts, clear and haunting. It was Theo's voice, but not really. It was twisted, distorted, like it had been pulled through the very fabric of the sound, and now it came for him, clawing at his mind. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a living thing, an entity that had been born from his guilt, from his inability to let go of the past. "I'm sorry," Ezra whispered, his voice breaking. "I couldn't save you. I couldn't save you, Theo." But the voice only repeated its message louder now, as if the sound had found a way to amplify it, pushing the memory deeper into his soul. "You failed me." "No." "No," Ezra gasped, his hands flying to his ears as if trying to block it out. But it was no use. The voice was inside him now, consuming him, feeding on his remorse. The walls around him trembled, vibrating with the intensity of the sound, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply, the chill seeping into his bones. It was as though the house itself was reacting to the force of his emotion, as if it too were a victim of the grief that had once plagued him. Then, suddenly, a new voice rose over the hum. It wasn't Theo. It wasn't Dahlia. It was his mother. Ezra. The voice was faint but unmistakable. It wasn't a memory. It was real, cutting through the silence like a blade. The last time Ezra had heard her voice, she had been distant, cold. But now there was something else. Something raw. Something broken. His mind flashed back to the moments after the accident, the moments after everything had fallen apart. His mother hadn't screamed, hadn't cried. She shut down, turning away from him, leaving him to wrestle with the guilt alone. But now, in the depths of the sound, her voice was calling to him again. "Mom." Ezra gasped, his hands shaking, his body trembling with the intensity of his emotions. He closed his eyes, and the image of her face, pale and withdrawn, floated into his mind. "Ezra," she repeated, her voice wavering. "You didn't just lose him. You lost yourself." The sound. "It calls to you, Ezra. It always has." Ezra's heart raced. The sound. It had taken everything. It had taken Theo. It had taken Dahlia. And now it was reaching for him. But his mother's voice wasn't just an echo. It wasn't just a memory. It was a message, a warning. The hum was no longer just something that followed him. It was a part of him now, a part of his past, feeding on everything he couldn't let go. And as the hum grew louder, as the walls of the house seemed to close in tighter, Ezra realized with terrifying clarity, there was no escaping it. Not now. The sound had already consumed him. You didn't save him. The voice was louder, clearer now, a chant that repeated over and over, filling the space, vibrating through his skin. The walls trembled again, but this time it wasn't just the house shaking. It was the ground beneath his feet, and as he collapsed, to his knees, everything around him seemed to fall away, the hum filling his ears until it was all that was left. And then, with one final deafening crescendo, everything went black. Still here? Brave. Or maybe you just like the feeling of being watched. Like, subscribe, and drop your time and location in the comments, so we know who's still out there. Now breathe slow. The worst is coming. The darkness that consumed Ezra was absolute. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was the absence of everything. Sound, sight, thought, time. It was as if the world had collapsed, leaving him alone in a space that was neither here nor there, suspended in an endless void where the hum no longer echoed. The sound that had once been his constant companion had faded, leaving behind an eerie stillness that pressed in on him like a suffocating weight. It was a stillness that felt like an absence, a quiet so profound it left him feeling as though he had fallen out of existence. Ezra's mind raced, his thoughts scattered like brittle leaves in the wind. The memory of his brother's voice, distorted and twisted by the hum, was still fresh in his mind. "You failed me, Ezra." The words lingered, crawling under his skin, reawakening the old wounds that had never healed. His hands, trembling, reached out into the blackness, but they found nothing. Nothing but the cold, empty void. It was like being trapped inside himself, alone, unable to escape. He didn't know how long he had been here. Minutes, hours, days. Time had lost all meaning in this dark, infinite place. But then, in the midst of the silence, he felt it. Something sharp, cutting through the void. A flicker, a brief fleeting flash of light, as if something had pierced the darkness, offering a glimpse of something beyond it. He blinked, unsure whether it was real or just a trick of his mind. But the light appeared again, stronger this time, a faint glow that seemed to pulse in the distance. Without thinking, he moved toward it, his feet dragging, his body heavy, as though the very air resisted him. But the light was pulling him forward, drawing him closer. It was all he had left. This thread of something real, something that might offer an escape from the endless dark. His steps were slow at first, hesitant, unsure whether he was walking toward salvation or deeper into a trap. But the light was too powerful, too compelling to ignore. It was the only thing that mattered now. As he neared it, the light began to take shape. It wasn't a single source, but rather a faint, ethereal glow that seemed to swirl around him, like a cloud of mist, soft and inviting. There was a sound now, too. a low, distant hum, but different from the one that had consumed him. This was softer, gentler, like a lullaby, a whisper that seemed to comfort him rather than suffocate him. Ezra. The voice was familiar, but not distorted, not filled with accusation. It was the voice of his mother, but this time, it didn't echo in the space like a memory. It felt real, grounded, soft, and full of warmth. It pulled at him, urging him to keep moving. Ezra, it's not too late. His breath caught in his throat, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of his name, spoken by his mother, seemed to break through the fog in his mind. It wasn't just a voice. It was her. It was the connection he had been desperate to find. The bridge back to a life that had long since slipped through his fingers. He followed the light, and with each step, the fog seemed to lift. The oppressive weight of the darkness began to recede, and as he neared the source of the glow, he saw something that made his chest tighten in disbelief. It was a doorway, framed in soft golden light, the outline of it clear and tangible, like the promise of a way out. He hesitated. Was this real? Was this just another illusion? Another cruel trick of the sound? He didn't know. He couldn't trust himself anymore. But there was a part of him, deep inside, buried under the weight of guilt and fear, that wanted to believe it. Wanted to believe that there was still a chance to escape. Ezra reached out for the door, his fingers brushing the edges of the light. It was warm, comforting, like the embrace of something familiar, something he had longed for. The moment his hand touched it, the world around him seemed to shift. The fog cleared completely, and the door swung open, revealing a space beyond, a room that felt real, solid, as though it had always been there, waiting for him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Ezra stepped into something that wasn't warped, twisted, or suffocating. The air was fresh, clean, and he could feel the coolness of it against his skin, like the first breath of air after being submerged in water. The room beyond the door was bathed in soft light, its walls lined with familiar objects, bookshelves, chairs, a table, and windows that opened to a view of the world outside. It was home. It felt like the house he had grown up in, the one from before everything had gone wrong, the one he had lost the night of the crash. He stepped further into the room, his heart aching with the intensity of the feeling that washed over him. Everything about this place felt like it had been plucked from a memory, a time before the sound had begun, before the grief had taken root. And there, sitting at the table, was Theo. Ezra's breath caught in his throat. The figure was at the table, hunched over something, papers, a book, seemingly lost in thought. His brother looked the same as he had in life, young, full of promise, his face framed by messy dark hair, his smile wide and warm, as if nothing had ever happened. "Theo," Ezra whispered, barely able to speak, his voice thick with emotion. Theo looked up, and for a moment Ezra swore he could see the familiar twinkle in his brother's eyes. It was as if time had rewound itself, bringing Theo back from the edge of that awful night. But then, just as quickly, the warmth in Theo's face faded, replaced by a sorrowful look, one that made Ezra's heart tighten painfully in his chest. "You don't belong here," Theo said softly, his voice filled with sadness. It wasn't angry, but it was filled with something else, a deep, abiding sorrow. "You shouldn't be here, Ezra." Ezra's chest tightened, the warmth of the room suddenly gone, replaced by a coldness that spread through his veins. He stepped forward, reaching for his brother. But the closer he got, the further Theo seemed to retreat, pulling away like a shadow fading into the light. "No," Ezra whispered, his hands trembling. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to let you go." Theo's gaze never wavered, but his expression darkened as though something deeper, darker was beginning to cloud over his features. The hum, the familiar hum, began to creep into the room again, its rhythm rising beneath Ezra's feet, beneath his skin. And then, in a soft, almost imperceptible whisper, Theo spoke again. "You can't fix it. You can't bring me back. You can't undo what's been done." The words struck Ezra like a blow to the chest, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. His brother's voice was distorted, but not by the sound. This was something else. The hum, the presence. It was eating away at him. He was losing Theo again. "You're already part of it," Theo said, his voice cracking with an emotion that seemed foreign to him. "This place, the sound, it's taken you too, just like it took me." Ezra's eyes widened, and the room around him began to dissolve, the edges of the walls blurring, the warmth retreating like it had never been there. The door behind him began to close, the soft light retreating into nothingness. "No!" Ezra shouted, his hand reaching out to grab Theo, but his brother vanished before his fingers could touch him. The warmth of the room, the light, the sense of home. It was all gone, and Ezra was left standing in the void again, surrounded by the hum, the sound. Alone. The hum had claimed him. The sound was consuming him. And now there was nothing left but the absence. Ezra woke, or at least he thought he did. The line between waking and dreaming had blurred into a state of perpetual disorientation, his consciousness drifting like a leaf caught in the current of a dark river. His body felt weightless, as though he were suspended in space, untethered from the world he had once known. Every part of him felt distant. His limbs, his mind, even his own breath seemed to belong to someone else. The hum was still there. It had never left. It filled the silence, thick and unyielding, pressing against his eardrums, pulsing in his chest, vibrating in the very bones of his body. It wasn't just a sound anymore, it was a presence, a force that was inside him, around him, a force that shaped every moment of his existence. He couldn't tell if it was feeding on him, or if it had become him. He tried to move, to stand, but his legs were unresponsive, as though the ground beneath him had turned to sand, shifting and pulling him deeper into an unseen abyss. He didn't know where he was. The world around him was a swirl of darkness and fog, the edges of reality fraying like old paper. He could hear the faint whisper of a voice, distant but familiar, floating through the haze. Ezra. It was his mother's voice, soft and haunting. He had been hearing it in fragments, like a memory he couldn't quite grasp. It had been calling to him ever since he arrived in Hesperis, a whisper that had slowly become a thread, tying him to the past. The sound of it was a paradox, comforting and suffocating at once. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible, in the heavy air. "Mom, where are you?" The voice answered, but it wasn't a direct reply. It came in fragments, like pieces of a broken memory, like a song that had been lost in the static of time. "Ezra, you left me. You let me go." Ezra's heart seized in his chest. The words were sharp, accusing, but they were wrapped in the kind of sorrow he hadn't heard in her voice for years. His mother had always been distant after the accident, retreating into herself, burying her grief in silence. But hearing her now, her voice filled with such palpable sorrow and regret, it shattered him. "You didn't," he started, but his throat tightened, the words catching in the fog that clung to his mind. He had failed her too, just like he had failed Theo. He had failed them both. The hum rose in pitch again, its sound becoming a steady rhythm, a beating heart in the chest of the world around him. Ezra's pulse quickened, and as it did, the air around him began to shimmer, like a veil lifting just slightly, enough to reveal something else, a memory. The scene unfolded in front of him, as if it had been painted in the very fabric of the space around him. He was back at the scene of the crash. The road was slick with rain, the headlights of the car cutting through the dark, the windscreen streaked with water. He was gripping the wheel tightly, feeling the cold of the leather seat beneath him, the hum of the engine like a lullaby. Theo was next to him, talking excitedly as he always had, laughing, teasing, making jokes about everything and nothing. But then there had been that sudden shift. The tires screeched against the wet road. The car veered, jerking violently as it skidded off course. Ezra's heart had stopped, his mind had blanked, and in that terrifying instant, everything had become slow motion. He had tried to correct the steering, but it was too late. The world had spun, twisted, and then a burst of metal, a deafening crash, and the terrible, agonizing stillness that had followed. Theo was gone. The memory hit him like a physical blow, the weight of it pressing him back into the ground, making it hard to breathe. The image of Theo's laughing face was replaced by the twisted remains of the car, the blood, the glass. Ezra had been too late. He had been too slow. The sound of his brother's voice pierced through the crushing weight of the memory, distorted and echoing as it had in the church, in the mirror. "Why didn't you save me, Ezra?" Ezra gasped, his eyes snapping open. But the world around him didn't change. He was still there, still in the same fractured reality where the past and present collided in endless loops. He could hear Theo's voice, distant and warped, like a radio tuning into frequencies that didn't belong. It was as if the sound itself had become a bridge to the past, dragging him back to that moment again and again, a constant reminder of his failure. The world around him began to warp again, the edges of reality bleeding into each other, and he found himself falling into the darkness, into the sound. "You can't undo it, Ezra." The voice came again, this time from all directions, pulling him deeper. The fog wrapped around him like a cocoon, the hum shaking him to the core. He couldn't breathe. His chest was tight, his heart pounding with an intensity that was almost unbearable. "You can't fix it," the voice continued, distorted by the hum. "You can't bring him back." Ezra clutched at his chest, gasping for air. The sound was everywhere, inside him, around him, suffocating him with its presence. The walls of the room, the space, collapsed, melting away as the air grew thick with the weight of his regret. The hum had become something more than just sound. It was a manifestation of his failure, his guilt. The weight of it crushed him. Suddenly, the world shifted again. He was standing in the middle of a street, surrounded by the familiar faces of Hesperus. People he didn't know, people who were just shadows in the fog. Their eyes were empty, their faces blank. He could feel their gaze on him, 1,000 silent witnesses to his failure. And then, through the fog, a figure approached. It was his mother, her face pale and distant, her eyes hollow, as they had been for years. She stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate, as though she were caught between two worlds. "You left me," she whispered, her voice quiet but filled with a sorrow that felt like it was ripping through him. "You couldn't save him. And now you've lost yourself." Ezra's knees buckled and he fell to the ground, his hands pressed to his ears. But the sound wouldn't stop. It was too much to bear. He closed his eyes, but the images still came. The memory of Theo, the sound of his laughter, the crash, the guilt, and now his mother, her voice, her face, distorted and hollow, her words echoing in his ears. "I'm sorry," he whispered, over and over, but the words were meaningless now. He couldn't take it back. He couldn't fix what was broken. And then, as the sound reached a crescendo, something changed. A light appeared, faint at first but growing stronger, cutting through the fog. It was the faintest glimmer, a flicker of something that didn't belong in this world of broken memories and distorted sound. It was the light of hope. But even as Ezra reached for it, even as he felt himself drawn toward it, he knew deep down that it wasn't the end. The hum wasn't finished with him. It was only just beginning. The darkness that had swallowed Ezra seemed to pulse in time with the hum, each beat echoing through the hollow space of his mind. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was the absence of everything. No air, no sound, no sensation, except the deep, resonating thrum of the sound that had claimed him. It was like being submerged in a vast ocean, the pressure rising with every second, until it felt as if his chest would collapse under the weight of it. He could feel it in his bones, in the very marrow of his existence. The sound was alive, breathing, feeding on him. He could still hear it. The distant, broken voice of Theo, distorted beyond recognition, crying out to him in that same accusing tone. "You failed me, Ezra." He had heard it so many times now, in so many forms, each one more distorted, more haunting than the last. But this time, it wasn't just Theo's voice. It was the voice of the town, the voice of the sound itself. The force that had been feeding on the grief of Hesperus for generations, using it to tear open the very fabric of reality. "You should have listened," the voice repeated, louder now, its tone warped by the hum, pulling at the edges of Ezra's sanity. "You opened the door. You invited it in." Ezra's head swam, and his knees buckled beneath him. The ground was soft, shifting beneath his weight, and he reached out, his hands grasping at nothing, struggling to keep his balance. The room around him was a blur, no longer the familiar walls of his house, but something else entirely. The boundaries of the space were dissolving, the floor shifting, becoming soft and unsteady, like it was made of sand. The fog, thick and oppressive, pressed against him from all sides, suffocating until it felt like the world itself was folding in on him. The voice, the hum, it was all inside him now, an inescapable presence. Ezra could feel it in his chest, pounding, suffocating, like his heartbeat was in time with the pulse of the sound. It was the sound of grief, the sound of memory, and the sound of loss. It was the sound of everything he had ever tried to escape. And now there was no running from it. He staggered to his feet, eyes wide, looking around the room as if searching for an escape. But the walls were closing in. The sound was rising louder and more deafening than ever before, filling the space with an unbearable pressure. His thoughts were scattered, fragmented, torn apart by the weight of the sound. It was everywhere, inside his mind, inside his body, inside his soul. "You cannot run from this," the voice whispered again, this time softer, more insidious. "You invited the sound into your life, Ezra. It was always going to end this." "Way, no!" Ezra gasped, clutching his head in his hands, trying to block out the noise, trying to hold on to whatever was left of his sanity. "No, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean for this to happen." The voice, distant and ethereal, echoed in his mind, as though it were circling him, pushing him deeper into the abyss. "But you did. You couldn't stop it, could you? You thought you could leave, but the sound always follows. It's inside you, Ezra. It always has been." And then the hum changed. It wasn't the low, deep thrum that had consumed him for so long. No, this time it was different. Sharp, grating, like the screech of metal against metal, like nails on a chalkboard. The sound reached a new pitch, higher and more painful, digging into his mind, into his very soul, until every nerve in his body screamed in protest. His teeth rattled in his skull, his body trembling, every bone vibrating with the intensity of the sound. It was the sound of truth. The truth that Ezra had been running from. The truth he had been too afraid to face. His brother's death. His failure. The guilt that had followed him, clinging to him like a shadow, never letting go. Theo. Ezra whispered, his voice hoarse, trembling. "I'm sorry." But the sound didn't relent. It consumed him. It was too much. The sound was no longer just external. It had become his thoughts, his memories, his fears. It was his guilt. It was his pain. It was everything he had ever tried to bury, everything he had ever tried to escape. It was the sound of the accident, the sound of Theo's laughter, the sound of the crash, the sound of the moments that had defined his life, his loss. "You couldn't save him, Ezra," the voice whispered again, now unmistakably Theo's voice, distorted and stretched, filled with sorrow and anger. "You couldn't save me. And now, you've lost yourself." Ezra's body trembled violently as the truth settled into his chest like a weight he couldn't escape. The sound wasn't just the hum anymore. It wasn't just the voice. It was the manifestation of everything he had failed to accept. The loss of his brother, the loss of his family, the loss of himself. "I did try," Ezra gasped, his voice cracking with emotion. "I tried. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop the accident. I couldn't save you." The voice softened, a cold, mocking tone slipping in. "But you could have saved yourself, Ezra. You could have stopped running. You've spent your life running from this. But there's no running anymore." Ezra's knees gave out and he collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest as the sound twisted through him, through his very soul. His mind was breaking, the weight of the sound overwhelming him. His thoughts were splintering, shards of memories, of pain, of guilt, cutting through him like glass. There was no escape. Suddenly, everything stopped. The sound, the hum, the voices, all of it ceased. The air around him grew still, thick with an oppressive silence that swallowed him whole. For a moment, Ezra was left in nothing but darkness, his mind reeling, his body trembling from the strain. He opened his eyes, unsure of where he was. But the room, the house, was gone. The sound was gone. He was standing on the edge of something else, something new. There was a figure in front of him, cloaked in shadow, but as it stepped forward, the fog parted, revealing something familiar. Its call was Theo. Ezra's breath caught in his throat as he saw his brother standing before him, not as the distorted figure from the mirror or the warped image from his mind, but as he had been, full of life, full of promise. "Theo," Ezra whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Theo's face was unreadable, but his eyes were calm, distant. It wasn't anger or accusation that Ezra saw in them, but something else. A quiet acceptance, a weight lifted, a release. "You've come back to me," Ezra said, his voice breaking. But Theo's expression remained unchanged. He opened his mouth to speak, but it was the hum, the familiar, all-encompassing sound, that came instead. It swelled from within Ezra, rising up like a tidal wave, louder and louder, until it filled every part of his being. "You've already paid the price," the voice whispered, and this time it wasn't Theo's voice. It was the sound itself speaking through him, the sound of truth, the truth that Ezra had been running from. And as the hum crescendoed, Ezra understood. He had always been a part of it. From the moment he had arrived in Hesperus, from the moment he had first heard the hum, he had been lost, and now there was no turning back. The hum was a scream, a growl, a cry. It filled every corner of Ezra's mind, his body vibrating with it, every cell rattling as if it were part of the sound itself. He could feel it in his bones, in his chest, pulsing with an unrelenting force that seemed to tear him apart. The figure of Theo stood before him, unmoving, but the sound, the presence, was everywhere. It wrapped itself around him like a shroud, suffocating, invading, bending his thoughts to its will. Ezra's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears, though it did nothing to block the overwhelming din. The ground beneath him seemed to undulate. the walls distorting and bending like water rippling, as though the very fabric of reality was dissolving around him. Every time he blinked, the world seemed to shift, melting, only to be replaced by something worse. But through it all, Theo remained the same, standing, silent, distant, his face unreadable. Ezra gasped, his voice breaking, trying to speak through the chaos. "Theo, please, don't leave me. I didn't mean to." The sound swallowed his words. "You never did, Ezra." Theo's voice came, soft, but somehow cutting through the noise, clear and unyielding. "You never meant to, but you left me anyway. You couldn't save me. And now you're trapped with me." The sound shifted. It was no longer just a hum. Now it was a force, angry, demanding, relentless. Ezra's heart pounded, his vision blurring as the truth hit him like a tidal wave, pulling him under. "You are trapped here. Forever. No!" Ezra shouted, his hands trembling as they pressed harder against his temples, as if he could stop the noise, as if he could stop the inevitable. "I didn't mean it. I couldn't stop it. But the hum grew louder, drowning him, wrapping around his thoughts, smothering him. Theo's face began to fade, slipping from focus like a mirage. But the voice, Theo's voice, remained, not from his brother's lips, but from the sound itself. "You were never meant to escape. The town, it calls to you, Ezra. The sound pulls you in, and now you're a part of it. You always were." The sound cracked open the space around him, expanding, growing, until it felt like the entire world was being consumed. Every memory he'd ever tried to bury, every regret, every loss, was now flooding back to him, and he realized in that moment that he had never left this place. He had never escaped. The hum was a constant, a tether to a part of him that he couldn't sever. And as much as he'd run from it, he had been brought back, again and again, drawn here by the sound. But the price, oh, the price of silence. The fog in the room swirled around him, and he gasped for air. His chest constricted as his mind swirled with images of the past. The crash, his mother's hollow eyes, the emptiness in Theo's gaze when he had been consumed by the sound. He had thought that leaving Hesperus would end it, that escaping would free him from this nightmare. But it had followed him. The hum, the grief, it had been a part of him all along. You cannot escape. He closed his eyes tightly, trying to block out the sight of Theo, trying to block out the truth. But it was no use. The hum, like 1,000 voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand, kept rising in volume. Each word, each distorted whisper felt like it was tearing him open, pulling the very essence from him. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the house around him shattered. The walls cracked open, and the floor beneath him groaned as if it were alive, a gaping mouth that threatened to swallow him whole. The sound, the hum, grew, and Ezra felt himself falling, spiraling into the void. It wasn't the crash of the accident this time. It wasn't the sound of metal twisting. This was different. This was something more ancient, more primal. It was the sound of everything, of life, death, memory, and time itself, being torn apart at its core. The fog dissolved, the oppressive weight of it lifting for the first time in what felt like an eternity. And in that moment, Ezra understood. He wasn't just fighting the sound was him. It had always been inside him, a part of his grief, his guilt, his memories. The hum was not an external force. It was the manifestation of everything he couldn't let go of, everything he had buried, everything he had tried to escape. And now it had claimed him, body and soul. And then the figure of Theo reappeared, not as he had been, but as something else entirely. His features were obscured, but there was something about him, something cold, something ancient, that Ezra recognized. The figure reached out, and Ezra, still trembling, felt an icy hand on his shoulder. "You can't save me," Theo's voice echoed, but this time it was distant, as if it was coming from beyond a veil. "You never could." The coldness seeped deeper into Ezra, a chilling realization washing over him. The sound, the hum, it was tied to the town, to the past, to everything he had tried to bury. He had thought it was an external force, something that could be fought. But no, it was a part of him, woven into the fabric of his memories, his regrets, and his pain. And now, the price was clear. It wasn't just Theo who had been consumed. It was him. He was part of the sound now, a part of the very thing that had swallowed Hesperis. The hum had claimed the town, and now it had claimed him. He was no longer a witness. He was a part of it, bound to it, just like everyone before him. "The sound has always been here, Ezra," the figure of Theo whispered, his voice fading as the darkness began to reclaim the room. "You were never meant to leave." And with those final words, the world around Ezra collapsed into itself. There was nothing left but the hum and the silence, the weight of memory, the weight of silence. Ezra was lost. The darkness was complete. It wasn't the absence of light, or even the absence of sound. It was a vast, empty chasm where time itself had been stretched thin, as if the very laws of reality had been broken. Ezra's mind was caught between the dissonant hum that had been consuming him and the unnerving stillness that followed. Every part of him was numb, as though he were adrift in some vast, cold ocean, unable to grasp anything solid. His body felt as though it no longer existed, lost in the void that had opened up beneath him. The sound is all that is left. Ezra tried to move, to find some shred of agency in this new, suffocating world. But the more he attempted to push against it, the deeper he fell into the sound. The hum pulsed louder now, not just in his ears but in his chest, a constant, pulsing vibration that shook his ribs, his heart, and everything in between. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was him. It was the very core of him, like a reflection of the grief, the guilt, the fear that had haunted him for so long. The sound had become his soul. The past, the present, and the future were all swallowed up by it. There was nothing left to hold on to. Ezra's chest tightened, and for the first time in what felt like years, he tried to scream. But there was no sound, no release. The hum was too loud, too powerful. He opened his mouth again, but the void swallowed everything, his voice, his breath, his thoughts. His heart hammered in his chest, as if it too were breaking under the pressure. He was suffocating, trapped inside a hollow space where even his mind was no longer his own. And then, in the deepest part of the silence, he heard it. A whisper, soft at first, but unmistakable. "Ezra." He froze, his body stiff, his breath caught in his throat. The sound, the hum, was still there, but now it was different. The voice, her voice was faint, but it rang through the fog of his mind, with a clarity that sent a tremor through him. His mother's voice. "Ezra." He turned instinctively, as if expecting to see her, but the darkness around him remained untouched, unchanged. It wasn't the room where he had been before. It wasn't the house. It was nothing. Nothing but the sound and the feeling of her voice. It was as if she was calling to him from a place far beyond reach. The hum faded for a moment. The absence of sound, the emptiness, settled in, thick and heavy. And for a brief second, just a fleeting moment, there was peace. He could feel it, her presence. He was no longer alone in this broken world. "You're not lost," her voice whispered. "Not yet, Ezra." But the words weren't enough to pull him out. The weight of the past was too strong. The sound was too deep, too old, and it pulled at him relentlessly, drowning out the fragments of his memories that tried to break through. He couldn't escape. He couldn't breathe without hearing the hum, without feeling the pressure of his past folding in on him. His mother's voice cracked. "You never truly left, Ezra." The words were a knife. Each syllable felt like a fresh wound being carved into his soul. He had tried so hard to leave, to run from the memory of that night, from the crash, from the accident, from the grief that had followed him. But no matter how far he ran, no matter how much he wanted to forget, it had always been with him. The hum, the sound, had always followed, always feeding on him. He didn't want to hear it. He didn't want to remember. He didn't want to face the truth. But as his mother's voice faded, the space around him shifted, the void shifting as if it were alive, breathing, pulling him deeper into it. And in that shift, the memory came again. He was back at the scene of the crash. It was the same. The rain was coming down hard. The road slick, the sound of the tires screeching, the spinning of the car. He was in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with all his might. Theo was next to him, his laughter ringing in his ears, his words a jumble of excitement, of joy. It had been such a small moment in their lives, such a fleeting, innocent moment. But then everything changed. The car veered. There was no time to react. The world tilted on its axis. The screech of metal on asphalt, the sickening crunch of glass shattering, and then the silence that had followed. He had failed. He had failed his brother, his family. He had failed to protect him. "I couldn't save you," Ezra whispered through clenched teeth. "I couldn't." But no answer came. Only the sound, the hum, the darkness. "You didn't fail me, Ezra." It was Theo's voice again, but it was different this time. It wasn't distorted by the hum. It was calm, soft, filled with a tenderness that Ezra hadn't heard in years. His brother's voice was clear, as if it were coming from somewhere deep within him, within his very soul. The darkness around Ezra seemed to break, the sound subsiding, for a moment, as if it had been waiting for the right moment. And then, Theo's face appeared in front of him, clear, alive, as he had been in that final moment before the crash. His eyes were filled with something that Ezra could hardly comprehend. Compassion. Understanding. "I'm sorry," Ezra whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I never wanted to leave you." Theo smiled. It wasn't the smile that had twisted with pain or anger. It was a smile that carried understanding and perhaps even forgiveness. "You couldn't have saved me, Ezra." Theo's voice was soft. "But you can save yourself. You've been running for so long. You have to stop running. You have to face it." The hum faded again, the space around Ezra clearing for just a moment. It was as if he had stepped out of time, out of the endless cycle of pain, guilt, and regret. He could see himself again, standing in the wreckage of his past, standing on the precipice of everything he had lost. Theo, once again, became the symbol of what had been taken from him. But now, in the quiet, Ezra felt something shift inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. The weight of the guilt began to lift, if only slightly. "I'm so sorry," Ezra whispered, his voice breaking, and in that moment the hum, the sound, no longer felt like it was suffocating him. For the first time in what felt like forever, it seemed distant. Not gone, not forgotten, but more like a presence he had learned to live with, something that no longer had the power to crush him under its weight. But as the last vestiges of Theo's voice faded into the darkness, Ezra felt a new pull, a new pressure. Something was stirring again, somewhere deep within the hum. The town wasn't finished with him. The sound wasn't finished with him. It had claimed too much of him, fed too deeply on his grief. But there was a choice now, a choice between facing the past and accepting what was beyond the veil of sound. The hum grew quieter again, and this time Ezra wasn't afraid. This time, he knew that he was the one who could choose. The silence had returned, but it wasn't the same silence that Ezra had known before. This time it wasn't suffocating, it wasn't oppressive. It was a quiet kind of stillness, a brief pause between breaths, like the space between thunderclaps before the storm hit. Ezra stood alone in a world that felt both familiar and alien. The hum, though still present, was distant now, like an echo from another realm. The shadows that had once pressed in on him, suffocating him, had retreated, leaving him in a space of painful clarity. He wasn't sure how long it had been since the moment when Theo's voice had cut through the fog of grief and guilt. When his brother had told him, in no uncertain terms, that he was never meant to save him, that the crash, the death, the pain, they had been unavoidable. Ezra had spent years, decades, running from that truth, burying it under the weight of his failure. But now, standing here, the weight was no longer so heavy. It was still there, pressing against his chest, but it wasn't crushing him. Not anymore. The town of Hesperus was quiet now too. The fog that had once enveloped it was thinning, the oppressive mists lifting like a curtain being drawn back. He could see the streets before him, empty and still, just as they had been when he first arrived. The buildings too stood in silence, their windows dark and vacant, as though the town had paused, waiting for something, waiting for him. Ezra's gaze fell to the pendant in his pocket, the necklace that had started it all. The hum had quieted, but he could still feel its pulse, faint but steady, a constant reminder that he had never truly left. He ran his fingers over the cool metal, feeling the familiar weight in his palm. The symbol on the pendant had become synonymous with the town itself, a symbol of memory, grief, and sound. He closed his eyes, pressing the pendant against his chest, feeling the slow rhythmic beat of the hum. This sound, the hum, it wasn't just the sound of Hesperus, it was the sound of his past, of his choices, of the parts of him that he had buried. The sound had fed on his grief, had grown with his regret. But now, for the first time, it seemed like it was waiting for him to make the choice he had been avoiding for so long. And then, like a faint whisper carried on the wind, a new voice echoed in his mind. Ezra. It was his mother. Her voice was softer now, not harsh, not accusing, but filled with a sorrowful kind of understanding. The fog began to clear, and before him, in the distance, stood the silhouette of a figure, familiar but distant. His mother. "Mom," Ezra whispered, his voice thick with emotion, as his feet moved toward her. She stood in front of the remains, of the town's central square, the place where everything had begun. The fog, once suffocating, now parted around her, allowing Ezra to see her clearly. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, but the sorrow in her eyes spoke volumes. Ezra. Her voice was tender now, but there was a weight to it. You've been running from the truth for so long. You've carried it with you, fed it with your regret. But you have a choice now. You can stop running. The words hung in the air, resonating deep within him. Ezra swallowed hard, his throat tight as his mind swirled with the implications. He had always feared the truth of Theo's death, of his failure, of the fact that he could never escape the past. But now, for the first time, the sound, the hum, didn't feel like a curse. It felt like something that could be reclaimed. His grief, his pain, had always been a part of him, but the town had distorted it, consumed it. The hum had become the essence of everything he had been running from. But what if he could change? That? What do I do now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as though the weight of his question could shatter the stillness around him. His mother stepped forward, her presence solid, her face softening. You have to face it, Ezra. You have to confront the sound and the memory, the town, the hum. It feeds on what you've denied. You've been holding on to it all this time, afraid to let go. But you can't move forward until you do. Ezra's breath caught in his chest, the weight of her words sinking deep into his bones. He could feel the tension in his limbs, the tremble of fear that had followed him all his life. The sound wasn't just something external anymore. It was a part of him. It had always been a part of him, but it didn't have to control him. But what if I can't? He asked, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. What if the sound never lets me go? His mother's gaze softened, her hands reaching out, though they never quite touched him. The sound will always be with you, Ezra, but it doesn't have to define you. The past will always be a part of you, but it's up to you whether you let it drown you or let it guide you. A soft breeze stirred, carrying the faintest echo of Theo's laughter. It was a memory, a moment of warmth, of innocence, of a time before everything had broken. The sound of that laughter rang in his mind, pure and untainted by the hum. Ezra closed his eyes, feeling the weight of everything, the grief, the guilt, the loss, and he let it wash over him, but this time it didn't crush him. This time, it felt lighter, more bearable, and then something inside him shifted. The hum, still present but distant now, no longer felt like a suffocating weight. It had always been there, but it wasn't everything. It wasn't all-consuming. Ezra opened his eyes, and his mother's figure was no longer fading. She was there, standing in front of him, waiting. "It's your choice, Ezra," she said softly, the finality in her words clear. "You can face it. You can face the past and let it go. Or you can continue to run, but the sound will never stop." Ezra stood still for a moment, the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. His hands trembled as he slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out the pendant. The hum wasn't deafening anymore, it was faint, almost like a heartbeat. It wasn't his enemy. It wasn't something that had to be destroyed. It was simply part of him, a part of his past, a part of his grief. But it didn't have to control him anymore. He held the pendant in his hand, feeling the cool metal against his skin. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't feel trapped. The sound, this town, had always been a reflection of him. And now, he had a choice. He could stop running. And with that realization, something inside him broke free. The hum softened, its power waning, like a wave crashing against the shore, retreating. He let out a breath, slow and steady, and for the first time he felt the weight lift. The sound wasn't gone, but it no longer had the power to consume him. "I'm ready," Ezra said, his voice steady, though it trembled with the weight of the choice he had made. His mother smiled softly, and for a fleeting moment, Ezra felt the warmth of her presence, the love that had once been so absent, so distant. "Then it's time to let go," she whispered, and with that, the hum receded, leaving behind a quiet, fragile peace. Ezra was free. Ezra stood in the silence, breathing deeply, his hands still trembling around the pendant. The weight that had pressed against him for so long had finally loosened its grip, but the air around him was thick with something else, something that felt like both the calm after a storm and the unsettling quiet before the next one. He could still feel the hum, faint but present, like an echo that refused to fully fade. It was there in the background, no longer a suffocating force, but a reminder of everything he had endured, everything he had faced. He had made the choice. He had faced the past, acknowledged the grief and the guilt that had tied him to the sound, to the town of Hesperis. The town had never been a curse, at least not in the way he had thought. It had been a mirror, a reflection of everything he had hidden from himself. The sound wasn't some malevolent force, it was part of him, just as much as his memories, his failures, and his lost hopes. But it no longer controlled him. And yet, despite the calm, the hum lingered. It was a presence that had always been there, woven into the fabric of his life. It was the town's curse, yes, but it was also the ritual that had been performed so long ago, the ritual that had bound Hesperis to its own darkness. The sound was the product of that ancient ritual, the one that the town's founders had conducted in their desperation to transcend death, to manipulate the very fabric of time and space. But what Ezra had learned, what he had felt, was that the ritual could be undone. It could be broken. The sound was not something that needed to be destroyed. It was something that needed to be released. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on the rhythm of his breath, letting it steady him. The world around him seemed to pulse with the faintest vibration, but it was no longer oppressive. It was like a heart beating in time with his own, a reminder that life continued, even in the midst of all the loss and the darkness. The town, the sound, it was still there. But it didn't need to be feared anymore. He could still feel the weight of it, but it was no longer something to escape. It was something to understand. And then, from the edge of his consciousness, he heard it. Again, the sound, but this time it wasn't just the hum. It was different. It was deeper, more resonant. It was the sound of the ritual, the sound of the curse itself, reverberating through the bones of the town, through the air that Ezra breathed. It was an old sound, one that had been locked away in the fabric of Hesperis for centuries. The echoes of that first ritual, the one that had started all of this, had been hidden in the layers of time, buried in the hearts of the town's people, feeding on their grief, their guilt. The door behind him creaked open. Ezra turned to face it, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what it meant. He knew what was coming. It was time to finish what had been started. The room around him flickered, the edges of reality bending like a mirage. And then, from the shadows, a figure appeared. It was Dahlia. She was standing at the entrance of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and recognition. She looked different, changed, as if the weight of everything they had gone through had altered her in some way. Her presence was familiar, comforting in a strange, painful way. But there was something in her eyes now, something that spoke of the sacrifice she had made, the burden she had carried. "Ezra," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "You're here." He nodded, taking a step toward her, but the air between them felt thick, heavy with the unspoken words that had lingered between them for so long. She had been part of the town's history, part of the ritual, and now she stood before him, as much a part of the sound as he was. But there was something else in her eyes, something that told him she was no longer a prisoner of it. She had made the same choice he had made. She had chosen to let go. "We can't undo it," Dahlia said, her voice filled with an undeniable sadness. "Not completely, but we can stop it from continuing. We can end the cycle." Ezra's chest tightened. He understood now. The ritual, the curse, the sound. It wasn't about destroying the past. It was about breaking the cycle. The town's founders had sought to transcend death, to manipulate the very fabric of life and death itself. But in doing so, they had created a bond, an unbreakable thread between life and death, between the living and the dead. And the sound had been the result. It had been the means of binding everything together, but the cycle could be broken. The sound could be released. Dahlia stepped closer, her eyes meeting Ezra's with a kind of quiet intensity. "The sound is part of the town," she said, her voice trembling. "But it's not the end of the town. It's the end of us, of what we were meant to be." She reached out, placing her hand on Ezra's shoulder, and in that moment, Ezra felt it. Felt the shift, the change that had been building in him. It was like a door opening, a passage unfolding before him, the very fabric of the town and the ritual itself unraveling. The sound had always been a part of him. But now it was no longer the sound of grief, of guilt, or of the past. It was the sound of release, of closure. Dahlia closed her eyes, and as she did, the world around them began to shift again. The shadows that had clung to the walls receded, replaced by a soft golden light that bathed the room in warmth. The hum, the sound that had consumed them both, began to fade, its sharp, oppressive pitch softening into a distant echo. "It's time," Dahlia whispered, her voice barely audible. The light around them grew brighter, swirling, until it filled the space with a gentle, warm glow. Ezra could feel the presence of the sound, like a pulse in the air, in the very fabric of reality itself. But it was no longer suffocating. It was fading, like the last notes of a song drifting into silence. The hum quieted, the air cleared, and for the first time in so long, Ezra felt a sense of peace, a quiet understanding. The past, the grief, the sound, it was all fading, releasing him from the chains he had carried for so long. Ezra turned to Dahlia, his heart lighter than it had ever been. "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled softly, her face filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "We both had to let go," she said quietly. "But now it's over. The town is free, and so are we." And as the light enveloped them, the sound finally dissipated, leaving behind only the soft whisper of the wind and the promise of something new. The ritual was over. Hesperis was no longer bound. The past had been released, and for the first time in forever, Ezra could breathe. The light had finally receded, leaving behind a strange, uneasy calm. It was a quiet that felt like the world had paused, holding its breath, as though waiting for something, waiting for Ezra to find his way out of the labyrinth of his grief, to discover that perhaps, after all this time, there was still room to move, to breathe, to exist beyond the shadow of the sound. Hesperis was silent. The town, which had once hummed with the low, unyielding pulse of its curse, now stood still, untouched by the forces that had warped it. The buildings, long shadowed and hollow, now looked empty. Not in a way that evoked loss, but in a way that made them feel like forgotten monuments to something that had been long ago consumed by its own hunger. The fog that had once clung to every street corner had lifted, leaving behind only the crisp, cool air of the night. Ezra stood at the edge of what had been the center of the town, the square, once filled with the quiet whispers of the past, now seemed barren, as though it too had exhaled a breath it had been holding for centuries. But there was something else in the air, something faint, but unmistakable. It was the memory of the hum. It lingered, not as a noise, not as a presence that could be heard, but as something that had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of the world around him that even the silence felt full. It had been a part of him, of everyone in Hesperis, and now it was receding into the distance, a thread that had been cut, but whose end still fluttered in the wind. Ezra closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the cool air, allowing it to fill his lungs. He could still feel the weight of the pendant in his hand, the symbol of everything, the ritual, the curse, the town. But now it was just an object, no longer a lifeline, no longer the key to the past. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the present. His gaze shifted to Dahlia, who stood at the far edge of the square, her figure a silhouette against the fading light of dusk. She was quiet now, her expression distant, but her presence still anchored him. They had both seen it. They had both faced it. And now, the sound, the town, the curse, everything had been released. She turned toward him, her eyes meeting his across the empty expanse of the square. There was no longer fear in her gaze, no longer the terror that had once haunted her. She was free, just as he was, from the grip of the sound, from the weight of the past. But it wasn't just freedom that he felt. It was a kind of emptiness, an echo of everything that had been consumed, everything that had been lost. The weight of that emptiness pressed against his chest, and though the sound had faded, it left behind something new, a silence that felt too loud. "Are you ready?"
To leave?
Dahlia's voice broke through his thoughts, gentle but heavy with its own undertone. Ezra nodded, though part of him hesitated. He knew the town was no longer the place it had been. The hum that had defined Hesperis had stopped, but in its wake, something had shifted. "I think so," he replied, his voice a little strained. It was true. He could feel it. The town was no longer suffocating. The silence, though unsettling, was also an escape. The door to his past, to his guilt, had finally closed, and he was left standing on the threshold of something unknown. For the first time in his life, there was nothing to run from, no sound to drown out his thoughts, no ghost of the past to haunt him. There was only the quiet. But it was in this silence that Ezra realized the truth. He hadn't just been running from the sound. He had been running from himself. Dahlia took a step toward him, her footsteps soft against the cracked cobblestones, but each one felt like a reverberation in the empty square. She was closer now, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that Ezra couldn't quite place. "It's over," she said softly, almost as if reassuring herself. "The sound, the curse, the ritual, they're gone. We're free now." Ezra nodded again, though the word felt heavy on his tongue. Free. Could they really be free? Or had the sound, the ritual, the town, had all of it been so ingrained in them, in their souls, that they couldn't truly escape? Would they forever be tied to this place, even now, as it stood in the silence, abandoned and still? But the silence. "It feels too loud," Ezra said finally, his voice quiet, filled with uncertainty. Dahlia's gaze softened as she stepped closer, her hand brushing against the side of his arm. "It's only loud because you're hearing it for the first time. You've always been listening to the hum, to the sound, to the grief, but now there's nothing left to hide behind. The silence. It's just the beginning of something new." He looked at her, at the quiet understanding in her eyes, and for the first time, Ezra saw it clearly. This wasn't just a release from the sound. It wasn't just the end of the ritual. This was the beginning of something else, something beyond the hum, beyond the ghosts of the past. It was the beginning of living again. Ezra felt the weight of the pendant lift slightly as he unclenched his fist. The object was still there, but it was no longer an anchor. He held it in his palm, its smooth surface cold against his skin. And for the first time, it didn't feel like a reminder of what had been lost. It felt like something he could finally put down. For a moment, he thought of Theo, his brother, his constant companion in the memories of his grief. He thought of their laughter, their shared moments, the life that had once seemed endless. But now Theo was no longer just a ghost in his past. He was a part of the sound, a part of the town, a part of the release. And now, in the silence, Ezra could hear the absence of his brother. He could hear the absence of all of it, the grief, the guilt, the hum. But it was an absence he could live with. "You're right," Ezra said quietly, his voice steady now. "It's just quiet. Just silence. And that's okay." Dahlia smiled, and for the first time since their journey had begun, there was no fear in her expression. There was only the shared understanding between them, the acknowledgement of the weight they had both carried and the new path they could now take, together. As they turned toward the edge of the square, the first rays of dawn began to break through the horizon, casting soft light across the empty streets. The town, once trapped in the perpetual cycle of its curse, now felt like a place reborn. The hum was gone. The sound was gone. And for the first time, Ezra could finally hear the silence. The dawn's light filtered gently through the fog that still clung to the edges of Hesperus, soft and quiet, as if the town itself was unsure of what to do next. Ezra stood at the edge of the square, his feet planted on the cold, cracked stones, but his mind felt light, as though the weight he had carried for so long had finally begun to lift. The hum, the presence that had followed him for years, was gone. In its place was the silence, stretched thin and palpable, but not oppressive. It was a silence that spoke of endings and new beginnings, of spaces left open to be filled with something different. Dahlia stood beside him, her gaze distant but thoughtful, her eyes scanning the horizon, where the first pale light of morning glinted off the mist that still hugged the earth. She had been a part of the ritual, a part of the curse, and now she too was free, though it was clear that her freedom, just like his, was not without its cost. But now, for the first time, they both had the chance to decide what to do with the empty space that had been left behind. "What happens now?" Ezra asked, his voice a low whisper in the morning air. It was a question he had been carrying, even before everything had unfolded. What did it mean to be free from the sound, to be free from the ghosts of the past? What came next, when everything that had once defined him, the grief, the guilt, the town itself, was now gone? Dahlia's gaze lingered on the horizon, her expression contemplative. "We decide, Ezra. We choose." Her words hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. The sound had been all-encompassing, the hum that had shaped their lives. And, now that it was gone, it was as though a vast expanse of possibility stretched before them, infinite and unknown. "You think we can choose now?" Ezra asked, the doubt still lingering in his chest. "Can we really? Can we go on with our lives after all this?" She nodded slowly, the motion steady and deliberate, as if she were grounding herself in the certainty of her own words. "We can, but it's not going to be easy. The silence is deafening because we've never known it before. It's unfamiliar, but it's ours now. What we do with it, that's up to us." Ezra swallowed hard, turning his gaze toward the town again. He could see the empty streets, the deserted homes, the ruins of a place once trapped by its own history. Hesperus was empty now, not in the sense that it was devoid of life, but in the sense that it was no longer carrying the weight of the curse. It was quiet in a way that felt alien, untouched by the hum that had once distorted everything. Now, it was simply a town, no longer bound by any force, by any sound, but also somehow adrift. What was it without the hum? What was it without the curse? What were they without it? The thought struck him with a fierce clarity. The sound had defined everything. It had defined his grief, his guilt, his struggle to understand what had happened. And now that it was gone, now that the hum no longer ruled him, he was left with the question of who he really was. And that perhaps was the hardest part. Dahlia turned to him then, her face softened by the light of the rising sun, and Ezra saw something in her eyes that gave him pause, something that mirrored the feeling rising within him. There was fear there, yes, but it was tempered with something else, something deeper, hope. "We'll need to rebuild, Ezra," she said, her voice steady, despite the uncertainty in the air. "Not just the town, but ourselves." Ezra nodded, taking in the weight of her words. Rebuilding. It felt like a foreign concept, like a distant dream that had once seemed impossible. And yet here it was, standing before him, an opportunity to rebuild everything that had been broken. The town, yes, but more than that, himself. They had both been trapped by the weight of the past for so long, and now they had the freedom to choose something different. He exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of his own breath as it filled his lungs. He had made it through the ritual, through the silence, through the darkness of the sound, and the years of guilt that had haunted him. But what came next? What would it take to rebuild the man who had been lost beneath the weight of it all? Could he even recognize the man he had once been? The silence hung thick between them again. It was strange, but not unpleasant. The town had been a prison, but now it was an empty canvas. It was not just the absence of the hum that Ezra felt, but the presence of possibility. And then something shifted in the air. A movement in the distance caught his eye. He turned, his heart skipping a beat when he saw it. A figure, a person, walking toward them along the broken path of the main street. It was a silhouette, faint in the morning light, but it was unmistakably human. Dahlia noticed it too, her expression unreadable as she watched the figure approach. "What is this?" Ezra muttered, confusion creeping into his voice. "Who?" The figure came closer, its form sharpening against the fading fog. And then, as if all the years of wait, all the years of silence, all the years of running came to a head in this moment, the figure was finally revealed. It was the old woman, the one who had appeared in the depths of the church, the one who had murmured cryptic warnings to him just before everything had shattered. Her face, as wrinkled and drawn as it had been then, remained unchanged. She was standing in front of them now, her eyes filled with an inscrutable wisdom, and yet there was something different about her. Her presence wasn't ominous, it wasn't foreboding, it was expectant. "I didn't think you would make it this far," the old woman said, her voice rough, like the wind cutting through brittle leaves. "But then again, I didn't expect this either." Ezra stepped forward, his heart racing. What are you doing here?" The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes scanning the silent town before her. She looked almost pleased. "I've been waiting for you to find your way back to the truth. Now that you have..." Her lips curled slightly at the edges, but it wasn't a smile of malice. It was something else. "I suppose you'll want answers now." Ezra swallowed, his throat dry. "What happens now?" he asked, though the question felt incomplete, as if there was so much more to it than just that. The old woman had been part of the town's curse. She had known the ritual, the sound, the darkness. But now that the sound was gone, what was left? What did she want from them? The old woman's gaze softened. "What happens next is up to you, child." Dahlia stepped forward, her hand brushing Ezra's arm, grounding him. "We decide, remember?" The old woman nodded slowly, her eyes narrowing in thought. "Yes, you do. But first, you must decide if you will stay in this place, in this silence, where the town has died, or if you will take what you've learned and rebuild from the ashes." Ezra turned to look at Dahlia, seeing the weight of her words settle over her, and the weight of his own decisions pulling at him too. He could feel the pull of the town, the remnants of the sound still lingering in his bones. But he also felt something else, a freedom he hadn't known in years. He wasn't running anymore. The first step was to leave this place behind. He turned back to the woman, his voice firm. "We choose." And with that choice, the world around him seemed to breathe. The silence wasn't suffocating. It was something to be filled, to be lived in. And for the first time, Ezra knew that the weight of it was no longer a burden. It was a gift. The town of Hesperis, broken and silent, would be left behind. The first step into the unknown had been taken. The sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows over the empty streets of Hesperis. Ezra stood in the square, the ruins of the town around him, a reminder of everything that had come before, of everything that had been lost. The sound was gone now, but the weight of it still lingered in his chest, like the echo of a song you couldn't quite remember. The past, with its grief and its pain, had been buried beneath the silence, but the ghosts of it were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. Dahlia stood beside him, her gaze far away, lost in the same quiet reflection. They had chosen this moment. They had chosen to leave the town behind, to step out of the shadows of the past and into something new. But it wasn't as easy as just walking away. The silence felt vast now, like a wide-open space that stretched on without end. And in the distance, the weight of the world was still there, looming. "I keep thinking we're missing something," Ezra said, his voice distant. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but the thought had been gnawing at him since the old woman had left them standing there. It had seemed so final, so decisive. But now that they were standing on the threshold of leaving, he could feel something deep inside him. A sense that the silence wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Dahlia glanced at him, her eyes soft but knowing. "You think we're supposed to stay here? To rebuild?" "No," Ezra replied, shaking his head slowly. "I don't think. I meant to stay in Hesperis, but I feel like there's something we're forgetting, something we didn't finish." Dahlia didn't respond right away. She turned to face him fully, her expression pensive, as though she too had been wrestling with the same uncertainty. "Maybe what we've been looking for isn't in this place. Maybe we're not supposed to rebuild it, but let it fade. Maybe it's already finished." Ezra's mind spun at her words. He felt the weight of them, but there was something about her statement that didn't sit quite right. It wasn't the town itself he felt connected to anymore. It was the choices they had made, the choices that had led them here. Something about the old woman's final words had planted a seed of doubt in his heart. Something was still undone. A distant sound, a faint noise, cut through the stillness, making Ezra stiffen. It was small at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer. A footstep, then another. They both turned toward the sound, their gazes narrowing as they searched the empty street before them. The town, still and silent moments ago, now seemed full of a quiet energy, as if something had shifted beneath the surface. The air felt heavier, thick with an unspoken tension. From around the corner, a figure emerged. It was the old woman again, the one who had led them through the ritual, the one who had spoken of the cycle, of breaking the curse. But this time, she was different. Her face was softer, her eyes more human, less detached. She wasn't the same woman who had been so cryptic before. This time she was whole, in a way she had never been. She approached them slowly, her footsteps steady but purposeful. The light of the setting sun caught her face, casting her features in a warm glow that made her seem less like an apparition and more like someone who belonged here in this moment, with them. Ezra felt his chest tighten as she drew closer, but this time there was no fear. He was no longer running from the unknown. Instead, there was something in the woman's eyes that spoke of completion, of something finished and yet beginning again. "You've made the choice," the old woman said, her voice gentle but firm. But the choice was never about leaving Hesperis. Ezra frowned, confused. Then what was it about? The woman's eyes softened, and she stepped closer, her gaze locking with Ezra's. The choice was always about facing the silence, about what you do with it. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. You had to leave the hum behind, but you also had to leave your grief, your regret. Those are the chains that keep you bound. Ezra's heart clenched. He could feel the ache of everything he had tried to bury, the years of loss, the guilt of Theo's death, the weight of his failure. But now, standing here in the silence, he realized something. The sound, the hum, the town, it hadn't been the true source of his suffering. It had only mirrored it. The real weight was in the way he had clung to his pain. The real prison had been inside him. You can't just leave, Ezra, the woman continued. You have to take the step beyond it. Dahlia stepped forward, her voice quiet but resolute. What do you mean? What is it we still have to do? The old woman looked at her with the same knowing gaze. You need to let it go. Completely. No more looking back. No more trying to fix it. No more reliving the past. You've already paid the price for what happened. Now you need to decide who you are without it. Ezra's chest tightened as the weight of her words sank in. He had spent so long trying to fix the past, trying to outrun his guilt, trying to make sense of something that had never truly been in his control. But now, in the presence of the woman, in the presence of the silence, he felt something shift. He didn't need to fix the past. It was already behind him. His breath slowed as he closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. It wasn't the town or the hum or even the ritual that defined him. It was the choices he made now. It was what he did with the silence that stretched before him. Dahlia's hand brushed against his arm, and when he opened his eyes, he saw her standing beside him, her face filled with understanding. She understood it too. You're free now. Ezra, Dahlia whispered. We both are. Ezra nodded, feeling the weight of the silence again, but this time it didn't crush him. It didn't suffocate him. It was empty, yes, but in that emptiness there was room for something else, something new. The old woman smiled faintly, her presence comforting now, not haunting. You've made your choice, she said. Now, it's time to walk forward. The past can no longer hold you. The silence has no power, except the one you give it. Ezra nodded slowly, the finality of her words settling within him. He didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. He didn't need to carry the weight of guilt and grief with him, not when the world before him was waiting to be filled with something else. Thank you, Ezra said softly, his voice steady. I'm ready to move forward. With a final, knowing look, the old woman turned and began to walk away. The town, now empty, now still, stood in quiet acknowledgement of the end of the cycle. The sound, the hum, it was no longer part of them. The curse had been broken. Ezra took a deep breath, feeling the last remnants of the past slip away. It was gone, and with it, the sound had faded into nothing. The silence was no longer just a void. It was the beginning of everything. He looked at Dahlia once more, the future stretching out before them, uncertain but full of possibility. The first step had been taken, and with it they were free. Ezra stood at the threshold of the unknown. The air around him was still, heavy with the weight of his own breath, and the world before him felt like an endless horizon. He had walked through this journey, through the haunted streets of Hesperis, through the echoes of guilt and grief, through the trials that had torn at the edges of his soul. He had faced the hum, the sound that had bound him to his past and had broken free. But now, standing at the precipice of this quiet, empty future, he felt something he hadn't expected. Fear, not of the town or the sound or the past, but of what came next. The town of Hesperis stood behind him, still and silent. The ruins, the empty buildings, the cracked cobblestones, they were all a part of the past now, fading into the fog of memory. The sound had gone, and with it, the curse had unraveled. Ezra had let go of the grief, the regret, the anger. He had confronted it all, faced it down, and walked through the silence on the other side. But the silence, the stillness, had brought with it a different kind of burden, a burden of choice. Dahlia stood beside him, her presence a quiet anchor in the midst of this vast emptiness. Her gaze was forward, steady and unwavering, as if she had already made the decision that had been weighing on both of them. There was a strength in her now, something that had grown from the ashes of their shared suffering, something that connected them in a way that words couldn't quite capture. The road ahead of them stretched out like a ribbon of possibility. It was a road they could walk together or apart. It was a road that would take them somewhere new, but it would be shaped by the choices they made. "Are we ready?" Ezra asked, the question hanging between them, his voice a little uncertain, a little strained. It wasn't that he didn't want to move forward, he did. He had come so far, but there was something about this final step, this last choice, that terrified him. Dahlia turned to him, her eyes soft with understanding. She had always been the one who seemed to see through the layers of his doubt, to pierce the fog that clouded his mind. She had faced the sound just as he had, walked through the same darkness, and now she was standing in the light beside him, ready for whatever came next. "We've already made the hardest choice," she said, her voice steady, her words laced with a quiet certainty. "We faced the sound, Ezra. We faced everything that tried to hold us back, and now we have the chance to choose what comes next." Ezra felt a pang in his chest as he looked at her, and for the first time he saw the depth of what she had given him. Not just her presence, her comfort, but the truth she had shown him. The choice had never been about escaping the past, or fighting the sound, or undoing the mistakes they had made. It had been about moving through it, about letting go of the weight of it, so they could be free to step forward. It was about facing the silence that followed. But facing the silence meant facing the future. He could still feel the pull of the past, the residue of the hum in his bones. It was hard to shake, hard to let go of. But standing beside Dahlia with the weight of the past slowly slipping away, Ezra realized something else. The silence wasn't something to be afraid of. It was an open space. It was the absence of the hum, yes, but it was also the presence of everything that could be. The weight of everything that had held him back was gone, and now the future was his to shape. But even still, there was a finality in the choice before him. It wasn't just about moving forward. It was about what he would leave behind in order to do so. "We can't go back," Ezra murmured, the realization dawning on him as he said the words. It was the same realization that had been eating at him all this time, the thing that had kept him up at night, the thing that had haunted him even after the hum had faded. "We can't undo it, can we? Everything that happened, all the people we lost, Theo, my mother, all of it, it's gone. There's no going back." Dahlia nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "No, there's no going back. but that doesn't mean we can't move forward. We've faced the past, Ezra. We've confronted everything we needed to, and now the choice is ours. We can keep looking back, or we can keep moving forward, but we can't do both. The finality of her words settled into Ezra's chest, and for a long moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The road stretched ahead of him, empty and open. There was nothing left to hold on to except the choices he would make. And Dahlia, standing beside him, was the one constant that had never wavered. In the silence that followed, he realized that the choice was not just about whether to move forward, but how to move forward. He had carried the weight of his past for so long, but now, standing at the crossroads of his life, he could feel the shift inside him. He didn't need to carry it anymore. The silence wasn't just a void. It was a space that could be filled with new memories, with new choices, with new life. And it was up to him what that life would look like. Dahlia reached out, her hand resting gently on his arm. "Are you ready, Ezra?" Her voice was soft, but there was a quiet strength in it, a reassurance that anchored him in the moment. Ezra looked at her, seeing the same uncertainty reflected in her eyes. But there was something else there, something he hadn't seen before. A glimmer of hope, of belief. She had let go of her past too. She had stepped into this silence, just as he had. And together, they were stepping into the future. He exhaled, slowly, feeling the weight of the past slip from his shoulders. "I think I am." And with that, they turned toward the road that lay before them. It wasn't the road of Hesperus, or the road of the sound, or the road of the ritual. It was their road. The road of what came next. The final choice had been made, and with it, they stepped into the silence. The world before Ezra was empty, but not in the way it had been before. It wasn't a void, a chasm of silence that pressed in on him, making every breath feel like an effort. It was a silence that had room for everything, a silence full of possibility. He stood at the edge of the world he had known, the world that had been shaped by grief, by loss, by the hum of the sound that had once suffocated him. And now, as the sun set in front of him, casting its golden light over the empty streets of Hesperus, it felt like the beginning of something new. Beside him, Dahlia stood, her presence a steadying force in the growing quiet. She too had made it through the silence. They had both left behind the noise, the echo of the past, the oppressive weight of the town's curse. And now, the world stretched out before them, wide open and full of choices. The town behind them was still. The ruins of Hesperus stood as a quiet monument to everything that had been. The fog that had once rolled through the streets, thick and choking, was gone. The sound, the hum that had ruled everything, had faded. The town was empty now, free of the echoes of its past. But just as the silence wasn't an absence, the town wasn't just an empty space. It was a memory, something that had lived in the bones of the land, in the hearts of the people who had once walked its streets. And it was the last of its kind. It had passed, just as the hum had. Ezra knew it could never return to what it had been, but neither could he. He wasn't the man he had been when he first arrived, filled with the weight of guilt and the shadow of his brother's death. He had faced it all. He had let go of the sound, and now there was room to breathe, room to grow. "We did it," Dahlia said, her voice soft, almost tentative, as if she too was still processing the enormity of the silence they had stepped into. Her eyes met his, and there was something in her gaze, something new, something alive. It wasn't the fear or the sorrow that had once been there. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had chosen, who had made it through, who had moved. Ezra nodded slowly, his breath steady. though his heart still beat with an unfamiliar rhythm. He wasn't sure where they would go next or what awaited them. The road before them was uncharted, wide open and unknown. But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation. "We did," he said, his voice steady, though it carried the weight of everything they had both overcome. "It's strange, isn't it?" Dahlia smiled, a small, knowing smile, as if she understood the complexity of his emotions. "It is. But it's the kind of strange that means we're finally free to decide what happens next." Ezra looked around him at the empty square, at the broken roads and the faded buildings. Hesperus was behind him, the place that had once been his prison. But now, as he stood at the edge of it, he didn't feel like it was a place that held him anymore. It was a place he had left, and with it, he had left behind all the fear, all the regret. The pendant, still hanging loosely in his hand, caught the last rays of the setting sun. Its soft glow shimmered, reflecting the fading light as he turned it over in his palm. The symbol, familiar and foreign all at once, was something that had tied him to the sound, to the ritual, to the past. But now it was just an object, a thing, a part of the journey, but not the whole of it. He could let it go. He could leave it behind. He placed the pendant in the pocket of his coat, feeling the cool metal press against the fabric. It was the last of the sound, the last tether to the town that had shaped his life in ways he would never forget. But it was just a symbol now. The hum was gone. The curse was broken. Hesperus was silent, and now he was free. "Where do we go from here?" Ezra asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question had been there all along, hanging in the air, waiting to be asked. It was the question of what came next. The final question. Dahlia stood beside him, her gaze far ahead, as if she too were contemplating the same thing. For a long moment the silence stretched between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't filled with doubt. It was just still. And for the first time, Ezra realized that stillness wasn't the absence of movement. It was the presence of something else, something that could be filled. Finally, Dahlia turned to face him, a soft smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I think," she said slowly, as though finding the words as she spoke them, "I think we start walking. We walk until we find something worth building, something worth living for." Ezra's heart caught in his chest, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something that had been buried under the weight of so many years, of guilt, hope. He could feel it, a gentle pulse in his chest, a warmth that spread from his heart to his hands. He nodded slowly. "Walking sounds good." Together, they turned away from the square and began to walk toward the horizon, where the setting sun cast long shadows over the empty streets. The world around them was quiet, the hum of the past no longer suffocating them. There was nothing left to hold on to except the road ahead and the promise of the unknown. For the first time, Ezra understood. It wasn't the sound that had held them together, or even the town. It was their choices. It was the act of moving forward, of choosing to leave the past behind, and the realization that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to create. The world stretched out before them, empty and waiting. It was a blank page, a new beginning. And in that silence, Ezra found peace.